Hey guys, tonight we drift into a fog of lulling lavender and the hush of cobblestone streets under a silvery moon. You're lying awake, pressing your head into a pillow that smells like soft petals, imagining how a Victorian soul might wrestle with that same restless stir. You probably won't survive this without at least a hint of yawning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share where you are and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a narrow gaslit street in 19th century London, your breath visible in the crisp night air as horse-drawn carriages rattle toward distant inns. Inside a modest townhouse, a single candle flickers by a mahogany dresser, casting long shadows that dance gently on wallpaper patterned with roses. An English physician once declared that a good night's rest was as vital as a hearty breakfast, mainstream medical fact, right? Yet here you are, eyes wide, heart racing, listening to the ambient creak of floorboards that seems amplified by the stillness. Victorians often believed that melancholy or overexcitement caused sleeplessness. Historians still argue whether that was accurate or merely fashionable at the time. In the parlor, you notice a small ceramic bowl filled with water-tinted pale purple. A fringe belief holds that placing sprigs of lavender in water could bless the entire night with sweet dreams. You inhale the faint, powdery scent of lavender, thinking it might lull you into slumber as it did for many households across England. Outside, a soft murmur of midnight breeze rustles through the narrow laneway. You imagine Mrs. Harrington upstairs, reclining beneath a canopy bed, her lavender-scented bolster cradling her neck. She's awake, turning pages of a Gothic novel by candlelight because boredom and insomnia often went hand in hand. Among the wealthy, it wasn't unusual to have a dedicated sleep chamber with heavy drapes to keep out even a sliver of moonlight, and yet some still lay awake, coaxing their nerves with whispered prayers. Meanwhile, in quieter country manners, rural folk cultivated lavender fields that stretched like purple waves across rolling hills, an intriguing agricultural venture that bolstered local economies. That detail surprises you. Lavender wasn't just aromatic garnish, it was a serious cash crop in counties like Norfolk. By day, field hands carefully harvested blooms at dawn to capture the peak scent. The work was physically demanding, and some laborers believed the hills themselves whispered lullabies to weary farmers. Back in town, the concept of a bedtime routine was still evolving. Bed curtains closed tight, people might sip a warm infusion of chamomile or plain water, but lavender pillows were a novelty that spread rapidly once gentlefolk lauded their calming properties. The idea that a bundle of dried flowers could send you sailing into dreamland seems whimsical now, yet it was a mainstream remedy endorsed by herbal practitioners. Historians still argue whether lavender truly sedated or merely offered any true sedative effect. Beyond the scent, the very feel of a Victorian bedroom mattered. Feather beds heaved atop tall bedposts, and nightcaps lined themselves on washstands, waiting to slip onto weary heads. It was common to wear a woolen nightcap, a mainstream practice thought to retain body heat. Historians still argue whether these caps genuinely improved sleep or simply bred folklore. A quirky detail, some people tucked their cold feet into warmed clay bricks before bed, believing the gentle radiance soothed tired muscles and eased them toward drowsiness. Imagine yourself in a middle-class bedroom lit by a flickering oil lamp, the walls lined with framed engravings of pastoral scenes. You lay your head on a plump pillow embroidered with floral patterns, tiny sachets of lavender tucked inside. The air feels slightly sweet, as if spring itself slipped into the room. You close your eyes and feel a gentle tug toward sleep, though your mind drifts to the parlor below, where a widow sits knitting by lamplight, wrestling with worries of bills and ailing children. The heiress printed guides advised that warm milk and honey also helped, but combine that with lavender, and you might feel as if you're floating on a pillow of clouds. Some fringe commentators recommended wearing gloves soaked in lavender oil to bed, a peculiar notion that mixed aromatherapy with Victorian modesty, lest the oil stain fine linens. You chuckle at the thought oil-stained sheets were the last luxury anyone needed while chasing sleep. Meanwhile, physicians debated new findings suggesting moderate sips of whiskey might help. In a broader sense, every clink of glass, every creak of floorboard seemed amplified when the household retreated into darkness. A chamber pot's clank in the hallway echoed like a ghostly chime, while outside, the clip-clop of distant horses fell soft against your window. A door latch clicked downstairs, perhaps a servant returning, tiptoeing past the sick child coughing faintly in the dim hall. The smell of burning tallow drifted through the woodwork, mixing with lavender's sweetness. That hush felt alive and strangely comforting, as if the night itself conspired to cradle you gently. So as you rest against your own lavender pillow, imagine that mix of hopeful scent and whispered prayers that define countless Victorian nights. The world outside may have darkened, but inside, each believer in lavender's lure crept closer to a fragile peace, balancing hope against the eerie quiet. And as the hour grows late, you may feel that weight of centuries past settle softly on your eyelids, coaxing your own breathing toward a slower rhythm. Maybe you wiggle beneath sheets that mosquitoes rattled against the lavender petals, a reminder that even the finest remedies could not tame every sound laced under the nose. Historians still argue whether this alignment of humors genuinely guided better rest or merely reinforced fashionable anxieties. Imagine yourself seated in a high-backed armchair in a somber study, where tiny fires crackle in the hearth and the walls taste of faded velvet drapes. A physician's ledger lies open on a small oak table, its pages inscribed with cursive notes. Patient complains of nocturnal fretfulness, pulse racing, recommends tincture of valerian and obligatory warm bath. That prescription for a warm bath, a mainstream remedy, reflects the era's trust in hydrotherapy. Immerse the body in tepid water spiked with lavender petals, and let the temperature coax your limbs into heaviness. Yet a quirky fringe belief whispered that dunking your head under cold water thrice before bed would shock you into drowsiness, a shock similar to realizing you left your wallet on the train. Suddenly, you're too distracted to stay awake. Every physician worth his salt had an opinion on laudanum, tincture of opium, a mainstream sedative used to lull restless patients. Imagine a silver-topped bottle perched on a crescent moon-shaped bedside table, its label promising sweet oblivion. But here emerges a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether laudanum truly alleviated the sleepless soul or simply traded one nightmare for another, leaving the mind foggy and the body crumbling. A quirky detail: some families believed that replacing laudanum with a teaspoon of beet syrup offered a gentler path to slumber, though beet syrup tasted like liquid dirt with a touch of heartbreak. You might snicker at that. Sweet dreams, indeed. As you picture yourself reclining in that velvet-swathed bedroom, you catch the faint clink of porcelain in a distant hallway. A visiting homeopath arrives, hat in hand. Homeopathy, a fringe discipline, insisted that subdoses of a plant extract could cure the symptoms it resembled, a drop of belladonna, for instance, for someone whose mind raged like a thunderstorm at midnight. The mainstream medical community, however, dismissed these remedies as mere placebo. Historians still argue whether homeopaths provided genuine relief or merely bolstered morale with endearing quackery. The homeopath sets down a vial of sleep essence number 7, distilled from moonflower petals and honey. How romantic, you think, though you imagine the taste crossing somewhere between nightshade cordial and dentist's nightmare. In the next room, a timid governess whispers of mesmerism and even quirkier approach. You've heard that Franz Mesmer touted animal magnetism, promising that a gentle hand over your forehead would realign your internal currents and send you drifting off. The idea seemed exotic, like wearing a velvet cloak lined with moonbeams, but also borderline absurd. Still, it captivated some restless aristocrats. The practice involved darkened rooms, faint piano tinklings, and a practitioner waving crystal-tipped rods over patients, eliciting faint tremors. Jokingly, you imagine yourself wrapping a sheet around your head and chanting, "Make me sleepy, Mesmer, make me dreamy." But in truth, mesmerism offered at least a tactile ritual when quiet desperation knocked at every yawning soul. Venturing into domestic life, you assume the stance of a middle-class patient prescribed a nightly routine: a cup of barley water, a few drops of laudanum, a lavender pillow, and perhaps a gentle patter of rain on the window. That blend of cures reflects the mainstream truth that sleep was deemed essential for maintaining the moral fiber of the empire. Historians still argue whether this emphasis sprang from genuine health concerns or a desire to discipline an industrious populace. After all, an exhausted worker toiled poorly, and a sleepless aristocrat gossiped too loudly at balls. Families tucked themselves into well-flocked mattresses stuffed with horsehair or feathers, which, for the record, could summon allergic sneezes loud enough to rival a brass band. In a corner of the parlor sat a shelf lined with jars of valerian root, powdered hops, and dried chamomile, each element considered a cozy, mainstream ally against wakefulness. But beneath that shelf lay a battered leather pouch of powdered crocodile dung, truly a quirky tidbit. Some fringe pharmacopoeias claimed that rubbing crocodile dung into one's temples created a cooling sensation that quelled racing thoughts, though the aroma, they said, resembled a swamp at low tide. You picture the look on a Victorian's face as they gingerly uncork such a pouch, nose wrinkled, wondering if they'd hallucinate pterodactyls dancing in the moonlight. In the bedrooms of well-to-do families, a massage regimen gained favor as a mainstream tactic, gentle kneading of the scalp and shoulders using warm oils laced with lavender. The idea, touted by certain European gynecologists, was that physical relaxation paved the way for mental surrender. A scholar might point out, historians still argue whether these massages truly improved sleep or simply allowed for a few stolen moments of solitude from demanding children and wailing servants. You can almost feel those silky fingertips working across your temples as the soft glow of candlelight flickers, shadows swaying like silent lullabies on the walls. Yet, for those beyond the city's elegant salons, folk remedies flourished. A quirky rural belief held that placing a snail shell under your pillow summoned the gentle groaning of snails at night, creating a hypnotic cadence of soft creaks. Imagine lying there, utterly perplexed, hearing what sounds like a snail opera. Some elderly midwives swore by a mixture of goose fat and chamomile poultice applied to the soles of weary feet before bed. You grimace at the thought of goose fat oozing through your stockings. Sleep apothecaries certainly knew how to flirt with the borderline absurd. But imagine a young Victorian mother, weary from nursing her third child, her eyes heavy as candle wax drips onto the hearth. She consults Dr. John Ashburner, a mainstream physician who claimed that silence and darkness might exacerbate insomnia, so he prescribed bright gas lamps dimmed to low glow and a nightly perusal of sentimental poetry, anything to distract the mind. Historians still argue whether such recommendations truly soothe nerves or if they merely indulged the Victorian penchant for self-inflicted melancholia. You picture her reading a few stanzas of Keats, sniffing lavender off her handkerchief, waiting for the lines to weave webs around her thoughts until drowsiness sets in. In grand hospitals, practitioners experimented with electrical therapy, a mainstream buzz that sent mild shocks through bedridden patients. The idea, to zap away restless nerves. Historians still argue whether these jolts were effective or merely served as a shocking bedtime story. A quirky subculture claimed that wearing an electric helmet to bed, complete with wires and brass knobs, would gently hum your brain into submission. You wonder how many spent nights drifting off only to jolt awake pondering whether their dreams were electrically induced or simply the result of too much tea. Meanwhile, you recall that whispered advice from a neighbor who recommended counting sheep, a practice rumored to originate in the Middle Ages. In Victorian circles, it was treated as a whimsical folk remedy, repetitively imagining fluffy sheep leaping over fences. Mainstream opinion suggested it helped focus a restless mind, though historians still argue whether this method held any genuine therapeutic merit or if it echoed pastoral fantasies better suited to bored monks than urban dwellers. You chuckle at the absurdity of picturing a city dweller in top hat and waistcoat, imagining sheep in a pasture just to lull himself to sleep. As you lie there, enveloped in lavender's soft embrace, you might wonder if any remedy, be it a stiff dose of laudanum, a homeopathic tincture of moonflower, or a gentle scalp massage, truly cured the restless mind. Perhaps the counsel of physicians, the experiments of homeopaths, and the oddities of folk healers all merged into a nightly ritual, offering not definitive cures but ritualized hope. A lingering concept, even in sleep's refuge, the mind sought control, whether through measuring one's pulse, inhaling sweet-smelling vapors, or whispering nursery rhymes into the dark. You might feel your eyelids grow heavy as you picture that layered tapestry of Victorian insomnia remedies, each method a delicate dance between science, tradition, and fanciful speculation. The ambient crackle of a dying fire, the delicate hiss of a kettle cooling by the hearth, the distant clip of a carriage wheel all blend into lullabies that neither doctor nor denizen could perfectly orchestrate. In this world, insomnia wasn't simply a lone struggle, it was a chapter in the ongoing dialogue between body, mind, and culture. And so, with a final inhale of lavender, you sense your own timeline slipping into night's embrace, images of tinctured potions and softly humming scalp massagers mingling with your dreams, offering a gentle prelude to sleep. You slip further into the soft haze left by the medical parlors and eccentric folk cures, your mind still lingering on the silver-tipped vial of laudanum and that peculiar pouch of crocodile dung. Now, drifting into the heart of our story, you find yourself tracing lavender's humble journey from fragrant garden bloom to nightly savior of Victorian souls. Imagine a bustling Victorian apothecary shop, flanked by dark wooden shelves sagging with earthenware jars. A pharmacist in a crisp linen apron methodically unscrews the lid of a jar labeled Lavandula officinalis, taking a deep breath as the powdery scent escapes like a summer breeze trapped in time. A mainstream historical fact, by the mid-19th century, lavender was officially recognized in the British Pharmacopoeia as a mild sedative. Historians still argue whether that listing reflected genuine therapeutic merit or merely the herbalist's lobbying prowess. Outside the apothecary's window, you catch sight of a fashionable young woman cradling a small reticule embroidered with lavender sprigs, having purchased a snippet of lavender sachet for her own boudoir. Lavender's ascent in Victorian culture feels as inevitable as the gas lamps flickering to life at dusk. But hold on, before it paraded its calming aura through every household, lavender was largely relegated to ornate porcelain bottles used for cosmetic endeavors and scented handkerchiefs held by debutantes. A quirky tidbit: some Victorians believed lavender oil could repel moths from silk gowns, tucking tiny wicks saturated with oil into wardrobes alongside shawls. Whether or not moths truly fled in terror remains unproven, but the polite consensus held that fragrant wardrobes were simply more civilized. As you walk along a narrow lane leading to a sprawling herb garden, consider how lavender's rise hinged on changing tastes. The Romantic movement celebrated nature's therapeutic touch. Poets waxed lyrical about fields of purple blooms swaying like gentle waves. A mainstream historical fact: Queen Victoria herself reportedly enjoyed bouquets of lavender in her private chambers, promoting the plant's status among the upper classes. Historians still argue whether her patronage truly sparked broader cultivation or if lavender's popularity would have soared regardless, driven by those fragrant guidebooks hawking restful nights to anxious readers craving relief from city smog and suffocating parlors. In the countryside, lavender fields stretched out like a lilac carpet, tended by farmers who once grew nothing but grains. You trudge through rows where bees hum, sipping nectar from tiny blossoms. Grounds softened by dew, the faint perfume tickles your nostrils, promising a gentler tomorrow. This transformation from grain to herb wasn't purely aesthetic. Lavender cultivation became a lucrative supplement to struggling agricultural economies. In counties like Kent and Surrey, lavender farming boomed in the 1830s and 40s, a mainstream historical fact, so much so that local fairs included lavender distillation contests, judged by steamers and perfumers. Yet some farmers scoffed at the notion that an herb could outperform barley. Historians still argue whether lavender's profitability flared briefly or sustained itself through champion exports to Europe and the Americas. Stepping between neat hedgerows of lavender, you spot a rustic, low-slung distillation hut, its copper still coaxing fragrant steam through braided tubing. You pause as the air thickens with warmth and resinous sweetness, the plant's volatile oils transmuting into liquid lullaby. That moment when watchful steam drifts skyward feels like witnessing a silent ritual: flower to oil, hope to sleep. Inside, a distiller balances flame beneath the still, monitoring the drip-drop of pale amethyst hydrosol into a glass receiver. A mainstream historical fact: many Victorian distillers employed a combination of steam and water distillation, believing this method captured lavender's truest essence. Yet a fringe distiller once swore that adding a handful of rose petals mid-boil captured Moonlight's spirit alongside lavender's calming compounds, a quirky detail that sounds poetic until you consider how a spoonful of rose leaf might muddy the oil's clarity. Historians still argue whether such embellishments granted any measurable relaxation benefits or simply sold romantic notions to tourists. As the sun dips lower, bathing fields in a honeyed glow, you recall a letter penned by a rural matron boasting that her region's lavender oil soothed not only sleepless ladies but also cranky livestock. That may sound absurd, but local farmers did rub diluted lavender oil into ailing cattle to calm them during calving season, another fringe practice. Mainstream veterinarians of the era, however, largely dismissed this as quaint superstition, insisting sheep and cows didn't care much for aromatherapy. You imagine a bewildered cow blinking at its shepherd as mint and lavender oils are rubbed along its spine, and you snort softly. You cannot unsee that image. Moving along, you find yourself in the drawing room of a middle-class household, where lavender pillows nestle like plump cloud islands atop mahogany-backed settees. A lady in lace gloves runs her fingers over the soft, embroidered fabric. She explains that her grandmother crocheted these pillows by hand, sewing lavender sachets in secret compartments so the scent could release slowly, night after night. That familial tradition captures how lavender's ascendancy wasn't solely commercial, it fused with intimate domestic crafts, passed mother to daughter. Historians still argue whether these handmade pillows had authentic soothing properties or if they simply offered the comfort of ritual, an act that lulled many more than any scent could. You lower yourself into a velvet chaise longue across the room, inhaling lavender's gentle perfume, feeling your thoughts untangle like strands of silk. In this cozy parlor, household manuals printed in 1870 suggested stuffing pillows with lavender and hops, a mainstream historical fact. Hops, known for mild sedative qualities, complemented lavender's aroma. Yet a fringe recipe in a dusty women's magazine advocated an even quirkier mixture: crushed snail shells to ground the head in the earth's stillness, which presumably helps seekers hear the quiet. You grimace at that. Lavender and hops I can accept, snail shell is a step too far, even for tranquil aspirations. As dusk deepens, you note that Lavender's ascent also hinged on Victorian spas, where patrons reclined on wicker lounges draped in lavender garlands. Brighton and Bath spas dotted the coast, offering lavender-infused steam rooms. Mainstream practitioners claimed the aromatic steam opened pores, easing daily tension. Historians still argue whether the steam treatments soothed beyond placebo or if visitors merely enjoyed lying in a fragrant fog while servants fanned them with palm fronds. A fringe spa director once installed a whispering cascade of lavender water droplets, convinced listeners would drift into dreams as they heard liquid trickle like a spring of peaceful oblivion. Your senses reel as you wander through memory, a seaside asylum where bedridden patients received nightly lavender sachets stitched by nursing matrons. That asylum paralleled mainstream mental health practices, lavender aromatherapy used alongside moral therapy, a mainstream historical fact where compassion and order were deemed as crucial as the pungent scent in regulating rest. Yet some attendants believed lavender could cure hysteria in young women, a fringe belief rooted in dubious psychology. Historians still argue whether such practices truly aided mental health or simply masked deeper societal anxieties about controlling emotion and behavior. In a more bustling urban scenario, you picture a steam engine rattling into a London station as crates labeled lavender essence for export are wheeled off onto carts destined for far-flung colonies. Lavender's ascent wasn't confined to Britain's green hills, colonial markets embraced it too. In India's hill stations, restless expatriates dropped lavender oil into humidifiers, chasing the memory of English fields. Mainstream colonial administrators saw lavender as a civilizing aroma, an olfactory reminder of home. Historians still argue whether this practice signaled genuine cross-cultural exchange or a subtle form of imperial nostalgia. A quirky footnote notes that some Bombay elites mixed lavender oil with local attar to craft hybrid perfumes, an unexpected cultural fusion that spoke of shared sensory longing. As you wander, dusk creeping into night, you recall how lavender's ascent culminated in an unassuming moment. A young nursery maid tucked a lavender sachet under a pupil's pillow to quell nightmares. That simple gesture, quintessentially Victorian, epitomizes lavender's newfound status, from garden oddity to nightly necessity. You can almost see the child stirring, inhaling lavender's softness, his dreamscape perhaps more placid than that of his feverish peers. The mainstream truth remains that lavender's sedative quality was never potent like a laudanum tincture, but among gentle remedies, it reigned supreme. Historians still argue whether lavender's efficacy lay more in its fragrance or in the comfort of tradition. You close your eyes, picturing those violet hills and distillation huts, imaginatively forging a thread from countryside to parlor to spa. The scent of lavender, once a simple adornment, now stands as a nightly beacon, an emblem of hope amid sleeplessness. As you inhale deeply, the floral perfume weaves into your memory, promising that just beyond your eyelids, a world awaits where lavender's quiet reign continues, soothing generations into dream. You step out of the drawing room and find yourself on a narrow dirt path winding into the rolling countryside, where rows of lavender stretch toward the horizon like rippling violet waves. You can almost hear the faint hum of bees as they flit from blossom to blossom, gathering nectar for that same oil destined for pillows and potions. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1840s, counties like Kent and Surrey were churning out nearly 20,000 pounds of dried lavender annually, all thanks to dedicated rural farmers who swapped grain fields for fragrant hedgerows. Historians still argue whether that agricultural pivot saved some villages from economic ruin or merely replaced one uncertain crop with another equally fickle. Imagine yourself trudging beside a farmer named Reggie, his boots sinking slightly into dew-kissed soil. Reggie tips his felt hat to you, and you notice the crinkled lines around his eyes, proof that this land has seen decades of sunrises and sunsets. He wields a simple sickle, its curved blade glinting in the half-light. You follow him into a sea of lavender stalks rising waist-high. Each slender stem supports dozens of tiny blossoms, their petals tighter now at dawn, soon to bloom wide and release their essential oils. A quirky detail, some farmers whispered that lavender plants grew best when sown under the light of a full moon, a fringe belief suggesting lunar rays infused the soil with extra restfulness. You squint at the sky, thinking, surely the moon doesn't care about my insomnia, but here we are, planting by moonlight either way. Reggie shows you how to harvest properly, a swift snip just above the woody base, ensuring that each stem will sprout fresh blossoms next season. The motion is rhythmic, almost meditative, and you can feel your breathing slow as you mimic his precise cuts. A mainstream fact: proper pruning techniques guaranteed that lavender would bloom twice in a season, allowing farmers to maximize yield. Yet, a fringe observation among gardeners suggested that talking kindly to the plants, reciting poetry or singing lullabies encouraged more robust growth. You can't help but chuckle at the mental image of a farmer serenading his lavender like a stubborn teenager. By mid-morning, the hillocks of freshly cut lavender lie in neat piles across the field, their heads facing east to catch the sun's early warmth. A gentle breeze carries a wave of perfume so potent it's almost intoxicating. You dip a fingertip into a bundle and inhale, feeling a slight buzz as though the lavender itself is whispering, "Relax, pal, everything's going to be fine." A scholarly debate arises in your mind. Historians still argue whether these fields were primarily commercial enterprises or picturesque showpieces for parlor conversations. After all, a visit to a countryside fair boasting Kentish lavender waves drew more tourists than some village fetes, boosting local tavern profits. In a cozy farmhouse nearby, Mrs. Blanchard hums as she arranges bundles of lavender on wooden racks in her attic. The sun filters through a small window, transforming the dust motes into golden flecks. A mainstream historical fact: many farmers built simple drying sheds, uninsulated lofts or barns with slatted windows to hang lavender bunches upside down, allowing air to circulate and preserve the flower's delicate aroma. Historians still argue whether this passive approach trumped early mechanical dehydrators that some pioneering distillers tried to introduce. You peer at those sun-dappled bundles and imagine the months of labor needed to hang, monitor, and rotate those stalks until they crumble into silky petals. While you watch Mrs. Blanchard gently tie another handful with twine, she shares a family tradition: before hanging the lavender, her grandmother would sprinkle hot sand at the base to speed drying. A fringe tidbit: some believed that heated sand accelerated the evaporation of moisture, thus trapping more essential oil in the petals. However, mainstream botanists warned that heat could open pores and degrade the very compounds prized for sleep. You watch the lavender stems twitch in the breeze, tiny dewdrops shimmering before they evaporate into nothing. As afternoon light fades to a softer gold, you follow Reggie to a small wooden cart he's hitched to a shaggy pony named Clementine. The cart's bed is already half filled with lavender bundles, bound and ready for the distiller. You clamber aboard, lavender brushing against your sleeves, carrying an almost dreamy haze that seems to blur the edges of this pastoral canvas. A mainstream historical fact: once fields were harvested and dried, bundles often traveled by horse-drawn carts for miles to reach distillation huts, since rail lines only serviced larger towns. Historians still argue whether transporting flowering lavender long distances risked degrading the oil's potency before processing. You feel a slight wobble as the cart rattles down a rutted road, lavender dust drifting like a gentle snowstorm from the heaped bundles. Clementine halts at a vintner's cottage repurposed as a small distillery. The cottage's low stone walls absorb the waning sunlight, and you step down to explore its heyday. Inside, a copper still hisses softly, echoing the rhythmic drip of collected hydrosol from an eye-catching spigot. Reggie bows his head in respect. He's been delivering to this very still for over a decade. You can practically taste the lingering steam, as though the air itself carries a sweet sip of warm lavender tea. A quirky detail: some distillers added a pinch of salt to the distillation vat, believing it helped separate the pure oil from water. Scientific consensus, however, suggested this only muddied the end product. Historians still argue whether such quirks were clever innovation or charming waste. As the sun finally dips behind rolling hills, Reggie invites you upstairs to inspect the finished oil. In a cool, dim loft, rows of glass demijohns bubble faintly, their contents shimmering like liquid amethyst. A mainstream historical fact: skilled distillers gauged oil quality by dropping a tiny bead of lavender oil into fresh water. If it floated and retained a distinct scent, it was deemed pure. A contested nod to tradition: historians still argue whether such tests were consistently reliable or merely part of the lore that differentiated master distillers from apprentices. You lean in, inhaling deeply, and the lavender aroma floods you, making your eyelids flutter like gauzy curtains caught in a breeze. Below, you hear muffled laughter as a group of farmhands lean against the walls, joking about how Reggie's lavender operation has grown so large that they joke of building a lavender monopoly, the lavender cartel, they call it. You grin, recalling that one jovial farmer once tried to trademark the phrase lavender lullaby, sparking minor scandal when another claimant pointed out a local choir already sang a lavender lullaby at village festivals. You can't help but think that even in the earnest business of sleep aids, Victorians had room for petty rivalries. When night fully embraces the landscape, Reggie lights an oil lamp cast in polished brass, setting it on a long wooden table cluttered with small vials. He offers you a sample, one drop on a slender glass rod. You bring it to your nose, and the lavender top notes mingle with a whisper of earthiness, a perfect marriage of floral and foliage. A mainstream fact, the resulting oil was often labeled with the date of distillation, because lavender oil peaked in potency within 6 months. After that, it waned like pruning the last blooms of autumn. Historians still argue whether storage methods, dark glass bottles versus tin-lined canisters, truly extended shelf life or if these were marketing tactics to sell more of the fresh stuff. You recall the crocheted lavender pillows back in that suburban drawing room, every stitch capturing the countryside's labor. Reggie presses a small vial into your hand, telling you to place it wherever you choose, your pillow, your handkerchief, even your tea. That single droplet is the distilled essence of hours of careful cultivation, from moonlit sowing to dawn harvest. And as you inhale it, you feel a gentle warmth radiate through your chest, a reminder that sleep doesn't always spring from static pillows or lantern-lit sleep helmets. Sometimes, it begins in the soil itself, where farmers bent over rows of fragrant blossoms, hoping their work would ease human rest. Finally, you walk back along the dusk-draped path, lavender carried in a small satchel swinging at your side. You can still feel the echoes of the fields, bees humming, moonlight glinting off cut stems, and Reggie's soft voice narrating each deliberate slice of the sickle. In this moment, you understand that cultivating those purple fields was less about profit and more about preserving a nightly ritual, a gentle promise to those who lay awake, eyes flicking to dark curtains, that somewhere, out in those scented hills, someone thought of them at dawn. You pause by a whisper-thin stream reflecting star-littered sky, dipping a fingertip into the cool water. The lavender in your satchel calls to you like a lullaby, urging your bones to rest after a day's journey. As you stand there, listening to night frogs croak a sleepy chorus, you sense that every stalk, every drop of oil, and every whispered lore combine to create a tender balm, one that still drapes over human concerns like a soft purple blanket. You follow Reggie's cart and step into the hush of the distillation hut, where the afternoon light filters through slatted windows and dust motes suspend like tiny dancers in the air. The entire room seems to breathe with anticipation, as though the walls themselves know you're about to witness lavender's metamorphosis from fragile blossom to potent oil. Inside, copper stills rise like ornate sculptures, bellied vessels with long, curved necks leading to slender, coiled condensers. A mainstream historical fact, by the mid-19th century, many Victorian distillers began using steam distillation rather than ancient water-only methods, believing it extracted a purer, more fragrant essential oil. Historians still argue whether steam distillation truly heightened lavender's sedative compounds or simply served as a selling point to silkily attired consumers. You trudge closer, feeling the floorboards creak beneath your boots. The air is humid, heavy with the sweet, herbaceous aroma of freshly harvested lavender. A fringe distiller's note comes to mind. Some rogue perfumers swore that adding a handful of rosemary sprigs to the still created a more complex sleep oil, an odd practice that, according to local lore, sent insomniacs into dreamscapes of roaming herb gardens. You can't help but smirk at the idea of adding rosemary, because nothing says gentle slumber like the aroma of Thanksgiving stuffing. Beyond the stills, a broad wooden table stands laden with bowls of lavender heads, their tiny flowers still clinging to delicate stems. You kneel to inspect them, plucking a blossom between your thumb and forefinger. The texture is papery yet slightly tacky, as though the oil leaches between the petals, begging to be released. A mainstream fact, distillers often harvested lavender at peak bloom when the petals were fully open but not yet wilting, to capture the highest concentration of linalool, the compound linked to relaxation. Historians still argue whether collectors truly recognized the science behind linalool's effects or merely stumbled upon them by trial and error. You stand, and in that moment, feel the room's temperature drop slightly. A cast iron burner beneath the largest copper still crackles to life, its flickering flames casting a warm glow on polished brass fittings. Steam begins to hiss as water in a secondary chamber heats, forcing vapor through the lavender-packed main vessel. You watch with rapt attention as lavender steam swirls into the coil, condenses into liquid, and drips into a waiting glass jar. A steady rhythm emerges, drip, 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 mirroring the quiet tick of a grandfather clock in some distant parlor. A quirky footnote darts into your mind. An eccentric distiller once claimed that reciting Shakespeare's sonnets over the still enhanced lavender's calming tone, because the sound vibrations altered the molecular structure, though modern chemists dismiss this as botanical bunk. Historians still argue whether such sonic speculations were genuine attempts at innovation or simply marketing mystique aimed at romantics craving moonlit poetry. You laugh softly, imagining a troupe of thespian distillers gathering by their copper cauldron to recite, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," as lavender oil trickled down. As you ascend a narrow wooden ladder to a small loft overlooking the main stilling chamber, you can feel the heady steam envelope you like a warm hug. Every pore on your skin seems to welcome the vapor, as though your body itself craves lavender's balm. The loft is dimly lit, only a single oil lamp flickers on a rough-hewn shelf, illuminating rows of glass hydrosol bottles with names like Calm in the Cup and Midnight Whisper. A mainstream fact, hydrosol, or floral water, was a byproduct of distillation prized for being a gentler version of essential oil, used for linen sprays and facial tonics. Historians still argue whether hydrosol held legitimate medicinal value or if it merely appealed to those too timid to dab potent oil on tender skin. The distiller's assistant emerges from behind a cellar door, wiping damp hands on a sodden linen cloth. He offers you a glass vial containing raw lavender oil that glistens like liquid amethyst. You unscrew the cork and raise it to your nose, send wafts upward in potent waves, floral, herbaceous, and faintly sweet, like dew-laden petals on a cool morning. Your nostrils flare. A fringe anecdote swims to the front of your mind. Some Victorian apothecaries insisted that sniffing lavender oil directly from the vial, a sniff therapy, as they called it, could cure bouts of existential dread. You chuckle, thinking that if sniff therapy could solve existential dread, starving poets might have staved off plenty of tragic destinies. You tiptoe back to the main floor, carrying the vial as though it were liquid starlight. In a corner, a small group of visitors in frock coats and bonnets stand around a demonstration table. The distiller's voice, rich and carefully measured, drifts over to you. "Observe how we separate oil from hydrosol using an Florentine flask. Notice how the heavier water sinks below, leaving the essential oil to float atop." You follow his gestures, the glass flask neck curving upwards like a swan's neck, the precise pouring motion that deposits droplets of precious oil into tiny amber bottles. A mainstream fact, amber bottles were essential to preserve lavender oil, as clear glass allowed UV rays to degrade the delicate compounds. Historians still argue whether other storage methods, like dark pewter flasks, might have served just as well or if amber glass was marketing genius. That lecture elicits polite nods and murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. You catch a woman in a faded bonnet gently dabbing a drop of lavender oil behind her ear, as though she's trying to ward off sleeplessness before she's even left the building. A quirky detail, some perfumed aristocrats believed that carrying a small lavender oil sachet in their pocket could calm seasick sailors, an odd crossover appeal. You picture a teary-eyed sailor clutching a lavender sachet as waves crash overhead, murmuring, "Steady on, brother," all while smelling like a hidden garden drifting on the ocean breeze. The distiller wraps up his demonstration, and you wander among shelves lined with labeled bottles, Lavender Excellence, Country Sigh, Queen's Own Calmer. Each label boasts origin details, distilled in Surrey, May 1858, or harvested beneath full moon, June 1859. A mainstream fact, many distillers took pride in dating their oils, acknowledging that freshness meant potency. Yet, a fringe distillation manual suggested burying filled bottles in cool, damp earth beneath oak trees for a fortnight, claiming it roused the essence. You waggle your eyebrows at this. Burying a perfectly good bottle feels reckless, even by Victorian standards. Historians still argue whether any such burial ritual influenced oil quality or if it was pure aromatherapeutic folklore. As evening settles beyond the horizon, a hut's interior cools, and the last of the hydrosol drains with a faint gurgle into a ceramic basin. You follow the distiller down a creaking set of steps into a narrow cellar, where barrels of aging lavender oil huddle in dark corners. The staves of oak barrels gleam under handheld lanterns, and the air smells faintly of wood and sweet herb, an olfactory reminder that lavender's potency matured like fine wine. A mainstream fact, some distillers believed that aging lavender oil for 6 months rounded its edges, making it less harsh on sensitive skin. Historians still argue whether aging truly enhanced its sedative properties or if it simply mellowed the fragrance for refined noses. In the corner of the cellar, a small wooden box holds a battered ledger, its pages yellowed and smudged.
You kneel to examine it.
Inside, entries record each batch, date of harvest, weight of flowers, yield of oil, and the distiller's notes, twin moon batch, fragrance more earthy. A fringe notation below reads, batch rubbed with cricket chirp recordings to enhance sleep qualities.
You smack your palm to your forehead. Nothing about lavender is off limits in Victorian imagination. Historians still argue whether such whimsical notations were earnest experiments or private jokes among distillers trying to amuse blasé investors. You stand and make your way back upstairs, inhaling the cellar's residual aroma of aged oil. Outside, the moon beams through a single high window, illuminating the copper stills like celestial beacons. You realize that every phase of the distillation process, from harvesting fields under uncertain skies to bottling oils in amber jars, was a testament to Victorians' quest for nightly peace. In that steamy hut, you sense the culmination of centuries of herbal lore, each drop of lavender oil distilled into hope. A faint yawn threatens your lips as you exit the distillery and step into the crisp night, lavender oil tucked safely in your coat pocket. The air feels cooler, the sky darker, yet your senses remain attuned to the ether of that sweet fragrance. You press on toward home, following a winding lane lit by flickering lanterns, carrying the distilled promise of restful nights. And as you walk, you imagine that someday, centuries hence, someone might take that vial out of a box, unscrew the cap, and inhale, feeling, if only for a moment, the gentle hush of lavender's quiet rain. You step through a creaking front door into a cozy Victorian parlor, the air still tinged with lavender from your distillery visit, and you notice the soft glow of lamplight dancing on patterned wallpaper. A nearby chiffonier holds an open sewing box, its lid propped by a spooled skein of lavender-colored thread. Here, in the heart of domestic life, households took those precious vials of lavender oil and handfuls of dried petals and transformed them into objects designed purely for rest, lavender-filled sleep pillows. A mainstream historical fact, by the late 19th century, women's magazines routinely published patterns and instructions for sewing lavender sachets and pillows, reflecting lavender's status as an essential bedtime accessory. Historians still argue whether these DIY lavender pillows offered genuine sedative benefits or if they primarily signified domestic ingenuity and genteel pastimes. You settle into an upholstered armchair, feeling the cushions yield like gentle waves, and watch as Mrs. Winthrop, the family's matronly seamstress, kneels on a rug strewn with fabric swatches. She selects a swath of fine cotton muslin embroidered with delicate rosebuds, an economical yet charming choice. A quirky detail floats in your mind. Some households believed that adding a scrap of their children's first-year christening gown to the pillow's interior imbued the lavender with extra familial love, making sleep almost a sacred affair. You smile at the notion of a pillow carrying half a century's worth of baptisms and bedtime prayers, as though fabric and fragrance could trap memory alongside scent. As Mrs. Winthrop measures and cuts, she recounts how her own grandmother used to stitch pockets into pillowcases to house lavender sachets before the age of larger sleep pillows. That smaller sachet style eventually gave way to full-sized pillows stuffed solidly with lavender and sometimes hops. Another mainstream historical fact, hops, known for mild sedative qualities, frequently accompanied lavender to intensify its reputed soporific power. Historians still argue whether combining hops with lavender truly amplified relaxation or if it merely mimicked the effect of one pleasantly familiar aroma layered over another. You close your eyes, imagining the mingling scents, floral lavender and earthy hops like a duet of complementary lullabies. You lean closer as Mrs. Winthrop stitches the pillow's edges with careful, even stitches, each tiny knot a testament to patient hands and nights spent awake. The pillow's inner contents are carefully measured. Layers of fine feathers form a soft core, overlaid by a fleece of dried lavender blossoms mixed with crushed hops. A mainstream fact, Victorian pillows often used a combination of stuffing materials, feathers for loft, cotton batting for softness, and aromatic botanicals like lavender to impart fragrance throughout the night. Yet a fringe practice emerges from Mrs. Winthrop's voice. She once heard of a woman in Bath mixing crushed snail shells into her pillow stuffing, believing the cool, mineral quality would ground her dreams in reality and ward off nightmares. You stifle a laugh at that image. Snail shell jigsaw puzzles in your sleep sounds like the opposite of restful. With a final knot, she tugs the pillow free and leans back to admire her handiwork. A compact square pillow, its cotton cover now plumped with fragrant stuffing, and it seems durable enough to withstand nightly tosses. Mrs. Winthrop remarks that some grand ladies preferred silk or satin coverings, which held scent differently. Mainstream fact, finer fabrics like silk or sateen were believed to help diffuse lavender oil more gently, allowing aroma to waft gradually through linen sheets.
Historians still argue whether these premium pillowcases materially affected sleep quality or if they served mainly as status symbols, signaling wealth and refined taste. You imagine a silk-covered pillow perched on a chaise longue in a lady's bedchamber, its lavender aroma drifting like a delicate perfume across satin sheets. You ask why some families opted for round bolster pillows rather than flat squares. Mrs. Winthrop explains that bolsters eased neck strain, supporting the head and shoulders in a gently inclined position. Another mainstream historical fact: bolsters were common in Victorian bedrooms to correct posture and aid breathing, theoretically encouraging deeper sleep. Yet, a peculiar anecdote surfaces. She once heard of a gentleman who insisted on stuffing his bolster pillow with peacock feathers for purported elegant support. The sight of a man's head resting atop a colorful array of quills makes you suppress another chuckle. Historians still argue whether creative stuffing materials like peacock feathers offered any true benefit beyond aesthetic novelty or if they simply added to the household's quirky reputation. The soft thump of a child's footsteps brings you out of your reverie. A young girl in a pinafore enters carrying a small basket of dried lavender heads harvested from the family's own windowsill planter. Giggling, she spills a few petals onto the plush carpet. Mrs. Winthrop gently shoos her aside, admonishing her to be careful with the precious botanicals. A mainstream fact: many Victorian families, from urban townhouses to rural cottages, grew lavender in window boxes or small herb gardens, ensuring households always had a fresh supply for crafting sachets and pillows. Yet some fringe communities, particularly spiritualists, preferred lavender grown under specific star alignments, convinced that planetary influences imbued the crops with unique calming properties. You raise an eyebrow at the thought of a lavender field guided by astrological charts, though you have to admit it sounds poetically charming. You move to a small oak table where a half-finished lavender pillow sits beneath a flickering kerosene lamp. The pillow's cover, a faded lavender gingham, bears tiny monograms stitched in dark purple thread. You trace the initials with your fingertip, imagining the hands that personified these stitches. A mainstream fact: monogramming linens and pillows was a widespread Victorian practice, signaling family identity and pride in one's domestic craftsmanship. Historians still argue whether monograms ensured personal connection to everyday objects or if they underscored class distinctions. After all, laborers' families seldom stitched elaborate initials onto bedding. You inhale the pillow's aroma, feeling your heartbeat slow as the tea-scented lamp flickers, casting gentle shadows across the floral motifs. As the kerosene lamp guttered low, you notice that some linen scraps have spilled onto the floor, revealing peculiar patterns: violets, daisies, and even distant stars. A quirky practice emerges: some households preferred fabric remnants printed with evening-themed motifs, sleeping cats, slumbering cherubs, or crescent moons, believing the imagery subliminally encouraged night's calm. You smile, picturing a cat softly snoring on your pillowcase, its whiskers twitching in some imagined feline dream. Historians still argue whether these visual cues genuinely influenced sleep or if they merely reflected Victorians' love of thematic decor. You watch as Mrs. Winthrop carefully fastens a narrow satin ribbon around the pillow's perimeter, knotting it with a tiny bow. The satin ribbon's sheen catches lamplight like a gentle tear of moonlight across the cover. A mainstream fact: satin or silk ribbons were common trims on Victorian textiles, adding a touch of elegance and sometimes binding internal sachets in place. Yet a fringe custom suggested switching out ribbons monthly. Each new ribbon recharged the lavender's potency, as though the fabric itself breathed new life into the scented petals. You smirk at the idea, wondering if someone kept a trousseau of ribbons just to ensure their lavender never grew stale. A subtle hush settles over the room as Mrs. Winthrop places the finished pillow atop a bedframe carved with motifs of vines and floral scrolls. Moonlight slips through gossamer curtains, pooling onto the pillow like a spotlight. You sense that this creation, simple yet painstakingly crafted, embodies the Victorian quest for nightly tranquility. You remember that demonstration at the distillery, the heady steam, and the hush of hydrosol dripping into glass vials. Now that distilled essence finds a new form, nestled in soft cotton, woven with threads of memory, and destined to cradle weary heads. A sudden rumble of thunder outside tugs you from your thoughts. Distant raindrops patter against the windowpane, producing a lullaby of soft taps. You lean back, glazing at the pillow, inhaling its lavender and hop perfume, feeling the hush of storm and scent merge. Lightning flickers, illuminating the monogrammed cover, and you imagine laying your own head upon this handcrafted treasure, every fiber steeped in history. In a corner, you notice a small pile of extra lavender petals still waiting to be used. Next to them lies a delicate thimble and a spool of peach-colored ribbon. You feel the gentle tug of drowsiness as if the room itself encourages your eyes to close. The combination of hops, lavender, and that slight lull of rain beyond conjures the nearly universal hope that when your head finally rests upon that pillow, every sniff will carry you to a softness beyond the day's worries. And with that, as Mrs. Winthrop extinguishes the kerosene lamp and the room dims into shadow, you feel the comforting weight of that pillow's promise. Your own chest loosens, breath softens, and you realize that crafting a simple sleep pillow in Victorian England wasn't just a domestic chore, it was a nightly ritual of hope. One fold of fabric and petal at a time, you curl deeper into that velvety hush spun from pillows and petals, but the story isn't finished yet. In Victorian homes, lavender's embrace extended beyond pillows into myriad nightly rituals. You settle at the edge of a polished oak dining table, where a teapot steams gently, releasing ribbons of scent that swirl like lazy dancers. In this home, lavender tea isn't merely a bedtime beverage, it's a ceremonious gesture signaling the end of daytime bustle. A mainstream historical fact: by the 1880s, many household guides recommended steeping dried lavender buds in hot water for 5 minutes and serving the infusion before bed, claiming it soothed frayed nerves and calmed digestion. Historians still argue whether lavender tea's purported sedative effect held any scientific weight or if it simply capitalized on placebo and bedtime routine. Your fingers graze the delicate china teacup etched with lilies, its saucer hosting a small spoonful of honey and a single sugar cube. You lift the cup, inhale the pale lavender infusion, and taste a floral whisper mingled with a hint of sweetness, like sipping a distant spring morning at dusk. A quirky fringe tidbit flits through your mind. Some Victorian spiritualists believed that brewing lavender tea under a waxing moon imbued the liquid with astral calmness, supposedly heightening dream clarity. You nearly snort at the mental image of teacups glimmering under moonlight as ghosts of poets and ancestors swirl in the steam. As you cradle the teacup, you notice the hostess, Mrs. Farnsworth, a tall woman in a lace-trimmed nightgown, approaching with a small tray carrying a linen-wrapped bundle. Inside, you spy a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with tiny violet sprigs. She explains that these scented handkerchiefs were passed among family members. One sniff could transport a restless sleeper back to grandmother's herb garden. A mainstream fact: lavender-scented handkerchiefs were common accessories for ladies and gentlemen alike, tucked into pockets or petticoats to ward off unpleasant odors and promote calm throughout the evening. Historians still argue whether carrying lavender in handkerchief form genuinely influenced mood or if it served as an elegant excuse to indulge in polite sniffing. You unwind a corner of the handkerchief, releasing a cloud of fragrance that mingles with the tea's aroma. The linen is smooth under your fingertips, and you picture restless guests at a visitation, discreetly pressing such a handkerchief to their noses as somber condolences are offered. How Victorian of them, sniffing instead of embarrassing sniffles in public. You marvel at how lavender brought a pinch of personal calm to formal, stiff upper lip gatherings. A wry thought darts in: if only modern awkward Zoom meetings had lavender handkerchief protocols, we might all feel a bit more serene as we unmute. As you sip your second cup, Mrs. Farnsworth pours a thin stream of lavender honey, an experimental sweetener crafted in smaller households. In one fringe recipe circulating among rural families, they infused honey with lavender buds and sprigs of lemon verbena, thinking that the citrus note balanced lavender's sweetness and soothed indigestion. A mainstream fact: honey was regularly added to herbal infusions to mask any bitterness, aligning with the Victorian belief that a pleasant taste encouraged compliance with nightly routines. Historians still argue whether such flavor pairings signaled genuine health benefits or simply demonstrated Victorians' flair for culinary creativity. You imagine someone gingerly drizzling lavender honey on toast at midnight, preparing for a nap rather than an actual meal, because Victorian midnight munchies, apparently, were a thing. Beyond tea and scented linens, you learn of lavender-infused baths, another domestic custom practiced in more affluent homes. Mrs. Farnsworth guides you to a clawfoot tub perched in a tiled bathroom where a porcelain pitcher of boiled water awaits. She sprinkles a handful of dried lavender buds into the tub, watching as they float like tiny purple boats on the water's surface. A mainstream fact: Victorian medical manuals often recommended warm lavender baths to relax both body and mind, with gentle claims of easing muscle tension and aiding sleep. Historians still argue whether the warmth of the water, rather than lavender itself, held greater sway in inducing relaxation. You dip a toe into the water, its warmth sending a gentle shiver of relief through your calf, like a minor miracle after a day spent in stiff boots. While you soak, faint strains of piano music drift through an open door, an amateur pianist practicing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. Some households combine lavender baths with soft music, choosing lullabies or slow waltzes to further coax drowsiness. That pairing stands as a quirky yet quaint tradition, a fringe notion held that harmonious notes and floral aromas harmonized with the body's natural rhythms, leading to more vivid dreams. You imagine a mother humming by the piano while her child squats in the tub, lavender petals floating around tiny toes, sleep training taken to a new level. A chuckle tugs at your lips, thinking of toddlers plotting their nighttime escapes while enveloped in floral-scented suds. You emerge from the bath to find a neatly arranged nightstand beside a four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet curtains. Atop the stand sits a small porcelain dish filled with lavender sugar cubes for a final pre-bed nibble, another domestic twist. A mainstream fact, sugar cubes infused with lavender were sold in specialty apothecaries, intended to be dissolved in warm milk or tea to sweeten the experience and soothe the stomach. Historians still argue whether sugar's direct effect on sleep, spiking and crashing blood sugar, undermine lavender's calming promise, or if spoonfuls of sugar simply soothe anxious hearts. You gingerly nibble one cube and imagine the sugar melting into milk, each sip a gentle promise that tomorrow's dawn will feel more manageable. A soft rustle in the hallway calls your attention to the child's nursery beyond. Inside, lavender sachets hang from crib rails like tiny banners of serenity. A mainstream fact, doctors and midwives recommended placing lavender sachets near infants' beds, believing the scent deterred restlessness and helped delicate lungs breathe easier. Historians still argue whether infant insomnia in Victorian times was more influenced by childhood illness or parental anxiety over potential night terrors. A quirky footnote, some midwives insisted on wedging a small lavender sprig between the crib slats so that the baby would breathe the scent all night, a gesture tinged with hope and maybe a touch of rosemary, just in case. You close your eyes briefly, picturing yawning infants swaddled in starched linens, inhaling lavender as they drift into dreams untroubled by teething. Back in the parlor, you notice the mantelpiece holds a small porcelain vase brimming with fresh lavender sprigs. Tending to houseplants, even indoors, was increasingly popular. A mainstream fact, Victorian parlors often displayed fresh lavender alongside ferns and ivy as part of the language of flowers, where lavender signified serenity. Historians still argue whether juicing these aromatic sprigs into indoor decor truly encouraged slumber or simply satisfied the era's obsession with botanical symbolism. You lean forward, inhaling the living bouquet scent, and imagine houseguests commenting on the arrangement over tea. Modern-day Airbnb hosts, take note. A faint plink from the piano signals that the music has stopped, and you realize your eyelids feel heavy. Lavender's subtle way of reminding you that you've gone on long enough. You sit back, feeling the worn tapestry of traditions wrap around you, tea, sachets, baths, sugar cubes, and fresh sprigs, all weaving into a nightly tapestry intended to cradle the restless spirit. How remarkable that these tender, domestic rituals endured, offering repose in a world where gaslight often flickered too bright for weary eyes. You stand from the table, lingering in the candlelit glow, and consider how each household, despite differences in wealth or status, held on to lavender as a quiet ally. You recall that crocheted pillow from Section 6, the field harvests in Section 4, and the distillation steaming ballet in Section 5. Each step converges here, producing not only scented remedies but also a constellation of small comforts. And just as Mrs. Farnsworth pulls a satin ribbon from beneath her sleeve, perhaps to tie a sachet around a teacup handle, you sense the gentle tug of sleep beckoning. In this moment, you realize that lavender's magic didn't simply reside in its chemical compounds, it floated in smiles exchanged over teacups, in the rhythmic lull of sewing needles, and in the hush of households tucking children into beds. The nightly ritual of slipping lavender sachets into gowns, inhaling lavender tea, or simmering lavender baths felt as inevitable as dimming the lamps one last time. It wasn't just about chasing sleep, it was about asserting a small measure of control over an unruly mind and a noisy world. You sip the final warmth of lavender tea, offering a silent gratitude to those who gathered blossoms at dawn, to the distillers whose steam whispered lullabies, and to the seamstresses who stitched each petal into cloth. For now, you bag that last whiff of lavender in your memory, letting it drift through your senses like a last gentle exhale. You step out into the cool embrace of night, the sky draped in star-flecked velvet, and find yourself drawn along a cobblestone promenade lit by flickering gas lamps. The world feels hushed, as though everyone else has already surrendered to slumber, leaving you alone with the gentle rustle of leaves and the faint chirr of crickets. In Victorian times, evening promenades were considered a mainstream health practice. Doctors prescribed moonlit walks for the restless soul, believing that the crisp nighttime air could settle frayed nerves and beckon sleep. Historians still argue whether these perambulations truly soothed insomnia or simply reflected the era's devotion to fashionable rituals under lamplit boulevards. You trudge along, head slightly tipped upward, so that the silver glow of the moon still kisses your cheeks. A subtle breeze carries the distant perfume of lavender from open bedroom windows, a scent you now associate with every restful notion. Modern asides aside, imagine yourself strapped into a woolen cloak, the fabric's hem whispering against your ankles as you pass row after row of neatly trimmed hedges. Somewhere ahead, a caretaker is finishing a nightly ritual of sprinkling lavender petals along the iron fence that encloses a public garden.
A fringe belief held that spreading petals on pathways helped guide dreamers toward peaceful slumber, as if the flowers spoke in petal language, this way, to rest. The cobblestones underfoot feel uneven yet grounding, each step a tiny vibration that resonates through your bones.
Women stroll beside you, their voluminous skirts brushing against silky muffs, some of which are scented with lavender oil. A quirky tidbit from the time, many ladies believed that carrying a lavender-scented muff not only warmed their hands but also released intermittent wafts of calming aroma with each movement, like a gentle lullaby for the mind. You can almost picture a lady tucking a dainty hand into her muff, inhaling a whisper of lavender as though it's a secret key to dropping the weight of the day. Beyond the hedge-lined avenue, the spire of a church rises like a silent sentinel, its clock chimes echoing, and yet, you keep walking, guided by a desire to lull yourself before turning in. A mainstream fact, most Victorian physicians recommended at least a half-hour walk after supper, believing fresh air stimulated digestion and balanced the night humors that caused wakefulness. Historians still argue whether the benefits stemmed from the actual act of walking or from the social aspect of being seen in public, as if appearing calm and composed under the moonlight somehow signaled that one had mastered the art of repose.
You pass a trio of gentlemen leaning against a wrought iron lamppost, quietly engaged in polite conversation.
Their top hats are tipped slightly forward, casting shadows over their pencil-thin mustaches. One of them occasionally lifts a hand to his collar, releasing a delicate wisp of lavender from a pocket square perfumed with oil. He regards you with a courteous nod as you pass, perhaps noting the way you hold your shoulders slightly slumped, as though the weight of the day still sits on them. The men exchange careful whispers about the latest literature on insomnia, debating whether a brisk pace or a slow, deliberate stroll yields better results. I find that a slow saunter allows the mind to unspool chatter, one murmurs, but my cousin swears that nothing defeats wakefulness like a solid quick step around the park. Historians still argue whether these debates had any empirical basis or were simply variations of fashionable advice passed down in drawing rooms. You continue until you reach the wrought iron gate of a small public garden, whose hedges conform to the shapes of mythical beasts, fawns, griffins, and birds you swear wink at you as you walk by. A child's ghostly laughter echoes from beyond a clipped yew tree, though you see no one. A fringe superstition held that spectral laughter in gardens signaled fairies dancing on dew-puddled petals, an omen that restful dreams awaited anyone willing to follow the sound. You pause, half expecting a glimpse of tiny glowing wings, and instead find a stray cat weaving between hedgerows. You chuckle quietly, if fairy dances can be elusive, at least cats patrol these nocturnal pathways. As you traverse a narrow path lined with gravel, each footstep produces a crisp crunch that echoes in the otherwise silent night. The lampposts overhead flicker as though breathing, their flame-like glow warms your face. You inhale deeply, tasting the faint tang of night air that mingles with lavender's sweetness drifting from open windows. Somewhere behind a wrought iron fence, you notice a small fountain. The water arcs in a graceful curve before landing in a shallow basin, producing a gentle hiss that acts like white noise to your ears. A mainstream fact, Victorian parks often installed water features because physicians believed that the sound of flowing water aided relaxation, mimicking the mantra-like repetition of counting sheep. Historians still argue whether the effect was genuine or if it catered to those who believed sensory novelties must accompany healthful endeavors. You settle on a wrought iron bench, sitting upright yet slightly leaning back, letting the night air lull your thoughts. Above you, tree canopies cast shadows that ripple like inkblots across the path. A woman glides by in a pale dress, carrying a small lantern. From the lantern wafts a hint of lavender oil seeping from a lampwick, igniting your curiosity. Some eclectic lamp makers injected a drop of essential oil into wicks to release scent with each flicker of flame. A quirky detail, a few Victorian lamp auctions even featured aromatic lanterns, prized for filling parlors with a continuous aroma. You imagine the novelty of strolling past lantern-lit promenades scented with lavender, like walking through a perfumed chiaroscuro. A gust of wind tussles your hair, and you notice how the foliage above stirs, releasing sporadic bursts of floral fragrance. You inhale them like morsels of calm, feeling your chest loosen with each breath. The hush of distant carriages, now rare at this hour, provides a gentle counterpoint to the fountain's hiss. In those days, carriages rolled through these avenues well into the evening, bringing travelers from ballrooms to boarding houses. A mainstay observation, some travelers believed that a post-ball promenade helped dissipate adrenaline, ensuring they arrived home with a steady pulse ready for slumber rather than lingering excitement. Historians still argue whether this practice grew from genuine medical advice or if ballroom etiquette demanded one be seen parading under lamplight before retreating. Your shoes grind along a section of gravel that slopes downward toward a small iron bridge crossing a narrow, slow-moving stream. Leaning on the railing, you peer into the water, watching ripples reflect moonlight like broken mirrors. You consider dipping a toe in, but the night air already feels crisp, so you content yourself with listening to the stream's gentle babble, another element Victorians valued for unwinding. A fringe belief suggested that standing barefoot in water for a moment cleansed not just your souls but your restless thoughts, a kind of aquatic exorcism of anxieties. You imagine Victorian souls removing their boots and slipping toes into the chilly stream, perhaps murmuring, "Begone, restlessness." Pressing on, you climb a rise that leads back toward the heart of town. The gas lamps become more frequent, their glow creating halos that dance on cooling pavement. You pass a modest row of terrace houses, each window edged by lace curtains. Some curtains flutter as though a breeze beckons, and you swear that every household's interior must be filled with lavender sachets, as though the entire town participates in one enormous communal snoozefest. A quirky scrape of metal behind a screen makes you glance over, perhaps a blacksmith finishing a late-night job, hammering out horseshoes by the glow of a single lamp. Martial clinks on metal could jolt anyone awake, but the smith insists that the rhythmic ring helps him find a meditative state before resting his own head. Your thoughts drift to the notion of walking yourself to sleep. If you walk long enough, the journey would tuck you in, as though the moon herself guided you down a silvery path to dreamland. You recall elderly guidebooks that cautioned walkers, avoid dark alleys, for fear of pickpockets, and maintain a gait neither too slow nor too brisk, precise advice based on the belief that pacing influenced heart rate, thereby affecting sleep onset. A mainstream fact, doctors recommended a steady pace of approximately 2 miles per hour, slow enough to encourage reflection but brisk enough to lull drowsiness. Historians still argue whether any of this advice extended beyond social norms dressed in medicalese. Further on, you notice an iron bench set beneath a sprawling oak whose branches hang low, like an old friend offering comfort. You pause and settle, letting the oak's shadow envelop you. A gentle breeze ruffles leaves overhead, producing a soft whisper, nature's lullaby, you muse. Across the street, in the dim glow of a gas lamp, you see a small bookstall where a clerk has forgotten to lower the canvas awning. Faded posters advertise midnight phantasmagoria at a nearby theater, irrelevant to your pursuit of sleep, but amusing as a distraction. A quirky detail, some theatergoers believe that attending a late show aided their insomnia by tiring their minds, though historians still argue whether adrenaline-laden performances actually hindered or helped sleep. You shake your head at that, recalling the romantic notion of actors' sleep, where the final curtain's drama sends you into a restless delirium. As the minutes unfold, you feel the city's heartbeat slow. The distant clip of hooves fades until only the murmur of wind and the hiss of the fountain remains. You lean forward, resting elbows on your knees, and watch your breath condense in the chill, tiny clouds that vanish like forgotten worries. You breathe in the scented night, a mingling of lavender and dew, and let your chest relax until each inhale requires only half the effort. You notice your shoulders dropping, your muscles yielding, and for a moment, the world holds its breath with you. Pulling your cloak tighter, you rise from the oak-shaded bench and begin the final leg of your promenade, moving toward home. The street narrows, and you pass under slender willow trees whose branches hang low, brushing against the pavement like soft knitting needles stroking fine wool. The lamplight here flickers more erratically, perhaps a wisp of wind teases the gas, or maybe the lamplighter has yet to refuel this post.
Regardless, the wavering glow suits the mood. You feel as though each step is a lullaby in motion. Emerging from the willow-lined lane, you see your own doorway ahead, its steps illuminated by a single bracket lantern. The world beyond seems distant, as though you've wandered into a pocket of time where only you and the night exist. As you ascend the steps, you pause, listening to the hush one final time. No carriage rattles, no dog barks, just the soft exhale of a world settling into rest. You reach for the brass knob, carrying with you the memory of every scent, sound, and sensation from this moonlit odyssey. Throwing your cloak over a hook by the front door, you step inside, leaving the lantern's dim glow to fade behind you. In the low light of your own parlor, you notice remnants of lavender sachets tucked behind curtains, perhaps left there by habit. You wander to the hearth, where embers smolder softly, and you sense that the walk has done more than soothe your body, it has eased your mind from its tangled cobwebs. With a final glance out the window, nothing but a sliver of moon peeking through drifting clouds, you realize that true therapy isn't found solely in scented pillows or oil vials but in motion itself, the gentle rhythm of feet on pavement, the hush of leaves overhead, the interplay of lamplight and shadow. In that realization, you feel sleep's first tendrils brush your consciousness. You offer a silent nod to Victorian walkers of centuries past, whose own midnight wanderings bridged the gap between restless minds and restful slumber. Your eyelids grow heavier now, and as you turn toward the warmth of your bedroom, the promise of your lavender pillow lingers at the forefront of your thoughts. Each step recaptures the hush of the promenade, carrying you further from wakefulness and deeper into the embrace of night. You slip from the cool midnight air of the promenade back into a dimly lit residential street where the lamplighters' flickering flares cast dancing shadows on cobblestones. As you walk, you become acutely aware that every step, every glance, carries a subtle social code and unspoken etiquette honed over decades. Victorian evening strolls weren't merely for health, they were a stage for observing and being observed. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1870s, respectable guides explicitly advised gentlemen to tip their hats to passing ladies and for women to carry proper parasols or reticules, both signals of decorum that defined a walker's station. Historians still argue whether these rules genuinely maintained propriety or simply reinforced class distinctions under the guise of civility. You trudge past a pair of young women seated on a wrought iron bench, sharing a sparing conversation in hushed tones. Their skirts brush the ground modestly, and each holds a black lace fan, which they occasionally flick to release a faint puff of lavender sachet tucked inside. A quirky detail, some fashion-conscious ladies arrange to have their fans scented with lavender oil, convinced that a discreet waft of lavender every few breaths signaled refinement and, if done correctly, could even convey flirtatious messages in fan language. You smirk at the thought of encoded lavender flirtations, a small flutter of the fan meaning your presence lingers in my dreams, or a more emphatic drop of the fan implying, let us walk, post haste. Historians still argue whether the actual art of fan flirtation held any serious weight in Victorian courtship or if it was more playful nonsense among debutantes. Continuing down the lane, you pass under an iron arch bearing a sign for Mr. Pembroke's Evening Walks where, for a modest fee, chaperone groups strolled through curated gardens. These guided promenades, a mainstream offering by leisure entrepreneurs, catered to families seeking structured exercise, ensuring that no respectable maiden found herself alone after dusk. Historians still argue whether these guided walks promoted genuine health benefits or were simply a shrewd way to monetize propriety. A fringe anecdote comes to mind. One adventurous group supposedly spiked the lemon-scented water fountain with lavender extract, leading to nightly delirium of giggles and whispered confessions. You laugh at the absurdity, imagine a herd of staunch chaperones turning into fits of giggles under the lavender haze. Further on, a solitary figure emerges under a gas lamp, a dignified gentleman adjusting his walking cane. His posture is erect, his gait measured. You notice he carries a small pocket notebook, pausing occasionally to jot discreet observations. Another mainstream historical fact, some Victorian walkers kept evening journals, recording page numbers of books they'd read or reflections on family affairs while strolling. Historians still argue whether these notes fostered genuine introspection or simply allowed the literate classes to appear philosophical in public. A quirky detail, occasionally, a gentleman recorded overheard gossip, tales of secret engagements or whispered scandals, jotted discreetly in clipped shorthand, as if he were a private investigator rather than a mere stargazer. You imagine flipping through one of these slim notebooks, discovering a hastily scribbled scandal about a baroness and an unclaimed love letter discovered under a pillow. You pass a group of dock workers fresh from the Thames, their trousers slightly dusted with mud, exchanging jovial insults. They tip their caps to passing ladies, an inclusive nod that signals community solidarity, an unexpected mainstream fact. Workers often integrated themselves into evening promenades to unwind from grueling 12-hour shifts. Historians still argue whether such inclusivity was genuine or whether workers joined mainly to keep an eye on fashionable thieves rumored to lift valuables under the cloak of darkness. A fringe rumor asserted that pickpockets favored evenings when ladies carried lavender-infused purses, thinking the scent would mask the jingling of coins. You giggle at the irony. Lavender, intended to calm nerves, potentially providing cover for petty larceny. As you move forward, two well-dressed sisters approaching you cast quick, calculating glances. One's fan doesn't quiver, so you deduce she's unamused. The other twirls her parasol with practiced grace, signaling poised confidence. Women walking unescorted after dark could attract scandalous whispers, a mainstream societal constraint often enforced by moral watchdog groups. Historians still argue whether these constraints genuinely safeguarded women or simply curtailed freedom, cloaked in moral panic. A peculiar footnote surfaces: a handful of radical suffragettes experimented with late-night group walks, flaunting social norms and carrying lavender bundles as badges of defiance. These women insisted that walking under the moon unescorted proved their seriousness in pushing suffrage, an act both brave and lavender-scented. You envision them marching down Main Street, scarves of lavender tied at their wrists, challenging the notion that night belonged only to men. Ahead, a retired colonel, still in full uniform, strolls deliberately, trench coat buttoned, medals glinting under gaslight. He nods gravely to you as you pass, and you notice a small tin matchbox in his hand, containing rolled lavender cigarettes, a fringe indulgence of certain military men who believed inhaling lavender smoke offered restful dreams after nightmares of battle. A mainstream fact: some veterans did experiment with smoking aromatic blends to quell nerves, though most regiments officially discouraged smoking anything but tobacco. Historians still argue whether lavender smoke genuinely soothed haunted minds or if it served only as an excuse for more tobacco. You suppress a grin as you picture the colonel flicking his lavender cigarette into a gutter, unnoticed beneath the unwavering stare of his medals. You approach a cluster of men gathered by a carriage stable, exchanging pleasantries and lingering glances toward well-appointed homes. Their talk drifts from cricket scores to the latest penny dreadful popular serialized thrillers that, ironically, kept many readers awake nights. A mainstream observation: penny dreadfuls were a staple of working-class entertainment, with new installments fueling both fascination and insomnia, readers struggling to put the cliffhanger down, lambasted authors for fueling late-night anxieties. Historians still argue whether penny dreadfuls harmed public health or simply filled evenings with guilty pleasure. A quirky detail: some enthusiasts tucked penny dreadful pages between lavender-scented bookmarks to soften the shock of grisly reveals, a subtle attempt to balance terror with calm. You imagine a ruffled page marked by lavender petals, guiding readers gently back to the narrative. At the street's end, you encounter a pair of Quaker sisters, their attire plain but their posture dignified. They hold bound Bibles under one arm and carry lavender sachets in small leather pouches, claiming that scripture and scent together formed an unbeatable nighttime doctrine. A mainstream fact: Quaker communities often embraced herbal remedies, including lavender, alongside their spiritual practices. Historians still argue whether combining religious texts with lavender presented a holistic retreat to faith and rest or if it conflated spirituality and superstition. You respect their quiet confidence as they pass, sensing that their twin paths of faith and flora offered them a unique source of solace. A couple promenades in slow, deliberate silence, he in a frock coat, she in a flowing corset-adorned dress. They walk arm in arm, conversing in gentle tones. A social expectation dictated that married couples demonstrate unity through coordinated attire and synchronized gait, a mainstream code that allowed society to deduce marital harmony. Historians still argue whether such expectations nurtured genuine marital bonds or simply forced couples into performative displays. A fringe anecdote: some spirited wives tied lavender sprigs to their husbands' buttonholes on strolls, believing the subtle fragrance ensured marital fidelity, because nothing says faithful spouse like floral obligations. You wonder if the lavender sprig served as a fragrant badge proclaiming "I own him," or if it simply offered a nostalgic whiff of shared optimism. Your footsteps carry you past a small bakery whose ovens are now cold, yet its window display still showcases freshly baked lavender biscuits, Victorian charcuterie's tender concession to insomnia-cured evenings.
You pause, recalling that bakers often baked a final batch of lavender-scented pastries for night nurses and watchmen who remained alert through the night. A mainstream fact, bakers in London districts produced lavender biscuits, believing that the subtle floral crumb aided restful digestion for those forced to work nocturnal hours. Historians still argue whether lavender-infused pastries truly improved nocturnal digestion or if they were simply a marketing ploy to sell more bread during slower evening sales. A quirky detail, sometimes a pinch of powdered lavender dusted the biscuit tops, akin to confetti at a sleepy party. You imagine early morning postal workers crumbling lavender crumbs as they trudged through dew-soaked streets, hoping a secret endorphin from the biscuit would keep them upright for just one more hour. As midnight edges toward the witching hour, you notice that the street has emptied. Only a lone lamplighter continues his rounds, snuffing lamps one by one. You pause to watch him lift his angled lamplighter's bracket against the flickering flame, drawing a muted hiss as he dips it into oil. A mainstream fact, lamplighters were often praised for their quiet, orderly work, understood to be essential to urban tranquility by ensuring streets remain gently lit but not glaringly bright. Historians still argue whether lamplighters choreographed the night's ambience or if they simply followed administrative edicts without any real impact on the public mood. A fringe belief suggested that a lamplighter equipped with a small sachet of lavender oil could boost the gas flame's soothing quality, an idea that might have been whispered among lamp enthusiasts but never officially sanctioned. You grin at the thought of a lamplighter casually applying lavender oil to each lamp. Now, that's street lighting with calm built in. Finally, you near your own doorstep, an elegant townhouse with curtains drawn tight and a lavender wreath hung beside the front door, signaling to visitors that this household's owners valued nightly calm above all. In the hush, you feel the final tendrils of alertness slipping away, replaced by a sense of belonging to a centuries-old pattern, the careful choreography of evening walks, the coded fan signals, the societal whispers that ensured no one walked alone unless deemed proper. As you place a gloved hand on the brass doorknob, you remember the lavender sachets in every pocket, the lanterns gleaming with faint floral notes, and the silent judgments passed under flickering gaslight. You push the door open, stepping across the threshold of your own home. Inside, the welcome warmth of a hearth and a lavender-scented bedroom awaiting you beckons. And as you close the door behind you, you sense that every footfall, every polite nod, and every whispered fanflick has carried you toward the soft realm of sleep. You pause for a moment, inhaling deeply, feeling the subtle tug of a carefully observed etiquette that guided every evening step. In that final breath, you realize that Victorian strolls were not merely exercise but a communal ballet, a shared ritual that instilled calm through order, fragrance, and the gentle hum of society winding down. You wake in the gentle half-light of early dawn, the soft haze of lavender still lingering on your pillow, and you realize that Victorian insomnia remedies weren't one-size-fits-all. Across town, in grand estates and soaring spa resorts, elites indulged elaborate cures, while in cramped tenements, common families relied on simpler means. Historians still argue whether these class-based differences stemmed primarily from genuine medical insight or if they merely reflected economic privilege disguised as healthful refinement. As you swing your legs over the edge of the bed, you recall how Mrs. Winthrop's handcrafted pillow smelled of hops and lavender, a comforting reminder that your own nightly rituals were a modest echo of wealthier habits. You trudge downstairs into the parlor, sunlight slanting through lace curtains to reveal a modest tea service. A steaming pot of lavender tea sits on a small tray alongside the remains of last night's lavender sugar cubes. As you pour a cup, your mind drifts to the opulent spa resorts popular among upper-class Victorians, Bath, Tunbridge Wells, and Harrogate, where the wealthy flocked to mineral springs and thermal baths. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1860s, spa towns emblazoned brochures proclaiming the curative virtues of restorative waters for nervous ailments like insomnia. The water often contained traces of magnesium or sulfate believed to soothe jittery nerves. Historians still argue whether these minerals genuinely induced sleep or if the elaborate environment, ornate bathhouses, marble colonnades, and scented antechambers provided a placebo more potent than any dissolved salts. In your humble parlor, you lift the delicate porcelain teacup to your lips, tasting the faint floral tang of lavender. Meanwhile, a few parlors over, Lady Marjorie Folkestone pads into her stately drawing room, her lavender-infused bath already drawn in a gleaming clawfoot tub. A butler in livery stands by, holding a silver tray laden with fragrant oils, petals, and a folded silk kimono lined with satin. A fringe detail ricochets through your thoughts. Some spa attendants claim to discreetly slip opium fragments into elite baths under the guise of aphrodisiac alchemy, convinced that a gentle narcotic boost enhanced the soothing waters. You smirk, heaven forbid the well-to-do endure a completely sober soak. You sip your tea, remembering that just last night you wandered past a bakery selling lavender biscuits, imagining street vendors in working-class districts hawking more mundane sleep aids, warm oatmeal gruel sweetened with a generous dollop of honey, boiled to mushy perfection. A mainstream historical fact, oatmeal breakfasts, and sometimes nocturnal bowls of porridge, were believed to bring calm to anxious minds, the thought being that bland grains encouraged gentle digestion and discouraged late-night hunger pangs. Historians still argue whether eating a bowl of mush truly facilitated sleep or simply prevented rumbling tummies from interrupting rest.
In contrast, elites could afford spa menus offering elaborate dishes like blancmange molded in flower shapes or custards perfumed with rosewater, dishes as sumptuous as they were soporific.
Setting your teacup down, you consider how the wealthy booked weeks at spa towns, where doctors curated personalized sleep regimens, mornings spent sipping mineral water at glass pavilions, afternoons in mild horseback rides through manicured valleys, and evenings reclining in lavender-steeped parlors while pianists in powdered wigs played soft nocturnes. A quirky snippet emerges. Some spa proprietors offered sheep sonata sessions, where visitors lay on benches while live sheep were led past, bawing softly, an auditory counting sheep trick meant to lull aristocrats into drowsiness. You stifle a laugh. Modern stop-motion animation has nothing on Victorian live sheep performances. Meanwhile, in a stone cottage tucked in the working-class district, Mr. Jameson, a foundry worker, rubs his aching head under a tin chamber pot filled with lavender water, hoping the steam will coax his overstrained mind into calm. A mainstream historical fact, families without access to spa towns often resorted to rudimentary steam inhalation at home, boiling water with a few crushed lavender buds in ironware pots, draping a towel over their heads, and inhaling the vapors for several minutes each night. Historians still argue whether such steam cures genuinely cleared anxious thoughts or if they simply offered a comforting ritual that interrupted restless thought patterns. As you take another sip, you imagine the foil-lined walls of Mr. Jameson's tiny parlor, where a single oil lamp flickers above a lumpy settee. His hands, calloused from the foundry, tremble slightly as he pours the scalding liquid into a chipped basin. A fringe practice comes to mind. In some overcrowded tenements, families sometimes sprinkled dried lavender petals on floorboards before bedtime, believing that the slowly releasing scent would combat the musty dampness of their rooms. You can almost feel the humid air, a mixed murmur of coal smoke, damp wool, and faint floral sweetness, an uneasy cocktail that, at best, masked odors rather than truly revolutionizing sleep. Your gaze drifts to the mantelpiece, where a small tin of lavender oil and a crusted loaf of bread balance precariously beside a family Bible. In a wealthier home, a similar mantel might display gilded bronzes, porcelain jugs brimming with fresh lavender sprigs, and oil lamps flickering tinted glass flames. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1870s, apothecaries in affluent neighborhoods marketed lavender oil at premium prices, sometimes as much as $1 per ounce, affordable only to well-heeled families. Historians still argue whether the high price tag reflected true quality control or if it simply capitalized on the upper class's belief that exorbitant remedies must be more effective. You lean forward, setting your teacup aside, wondering how each family fared under such stark contrasts. The elite, eager to demonstrate moral rectitude, also felt social pressure to display a proper sleep regimen. Letters in genteel circles frequently included tips like, "Dearest cousin, the vapor room at Tunbridge Wells worked wonders on my nerves, you simply must try the evanescent mists." Meanwhile, among commoners, conversation revolved around the new ginger-heavy ale brewed by a local tavern keeper, rumored to double as a sleep tonic thanks to copious hops and a dash of lavender tincture. A fringe rumor suggested that tavern keepers occasionally spiked the ale with other herbal extracts, valerian, perhaps, or skullcap, to ensure patrons ordered one too many jars and slept through their rent collectors. You chuckle, thinking that landlords probably weren't too pleased with that particular arrangement. Bringing the teacup to your lips once more, you recall visiting a seaside spa in Scarborough last autumn, a memory that feels both distant and luxurious. You reclined on a wicker chaise after a gentle saltwater bath, sipping lavender-infused brandy as a croquet match played out on the lawn. Nearby, groups of aristocratic ladies in pastel mantles clustered around wicker tables, softly fanning themselves and discarding lavender petals into teacups. A mainstream historical fact, spa towns often introduced flavored spirits, brandy or eau de vie infused with lavender, as part of nightly therapies, touted as aids to restful slumber. Historians still argue whether the alcohol or the lavender offered more sedative impact or if the real benefit was simply the rare indulgence and leisurely pace away from societal demands. Meanwhile, back in a crowded district near the docks, you picture dock workers returning home with grease-stained faces, subsisting on sturdy fare stews of mutton and barley, boiled until tender, occasionally spiked with a handful of dried lavender to mask gamey flavors.
A mainstream fact, incorporating lavender directly into hearty stews or broths was a pragmatic way to make the herb go further, ensuring families with limited means could still access its scent.
Historians still argue whether consuming lavender-laced broths had any tangible calming effects or if it simply helped hide off flavors in cheap cuts of meat. A quirky detail, some families insisted that adding the lavender only toward the end of cooking maximized its fragrance, so tablespoons of buds might be tossed in mere minutes before removing the pot from the fire, an anxious attempt to preserve every last aromatic molecule. Finishing your tea, you rise and move toward the window, looking out over rooftops where chimney smoke curls into a pale sky. Up here, your home feels serene, buffered from the clatter below. You remember that sprawling spa garden you toured, with marble benches shaded by pergolas draped in wisteria, and think of Mr. Jameson's cramped room where lavender petals sometimes lay scattered on splintered floorboards. A mainstream fact, historians note that affluent spa resorts advertised exclusive lavender gardens where guests could wander at dusk, inhaling fresh airs believed to be richest in therapeutic compounds. Historians still argue whether these gardens provided genuine chemical benefits or whether they simply heightened the perceived value of the spa experience. You lean against the sill, sipping the last dregs of tea, and realize that class-based sleep solutions hinged less on absolute efficacy and more on access, ritual, and impression. The elite invested in spa tickets, silk nightcaps, and live sheep recitals, luxuries that symbolized status more than guaranteed night-long rest. Meanwhile, commoners improvised with steaming basins, broth-scented lavender, and any scrappy bits of hop they could find, forging rituals that offered hope if not necessity. A fringe tradition whispers through your mind. In the poorest neighborhoods, some families believed that burying a handful of lavender under the threshold on Midsummer's Eve invited restful guardians, a folk remedy so quaint it teetered on superstition. You imagine a family of 6 huddled around a crackling hearth, shoveling lavender into the earth, convinced that unseen spirits would tuck them in. A sudden yawn escapes you, and you catch yourself curling a hand toward your lavender pillow, homely enough, yet a shared token in a broader tapestry of treatments. You recall how spa guests in Tunbridge Wells reclined under nets of lavender hanging gazebo ceilings, while at the same moment, a lamplighter in a narrow alley might have quietly clipped a small sachet to a lamppost, hoping to provide a faint waft of calm to passers-by. That dichotomy, lavender as both elite indulgence and plebeian pantry staple, underscores the era's uneasy dance between medical science and social spectacle. You place the empty teacup into a chipped saucer, feeling the day's beginnings tighten your shoulders. Outside, the first real light of dawn brightens rooftops, promising a new cycle of work and wonder. You sense that, despite these divides, a common thread binds every household, the desire to soften the night's edges, to transform insomnia from curse into quaint nuisance, whether through opulent spa treatments or simple sachets under a threadbare pillow. Before you step away from the window, you let the last echoes of lavender's promise wash over you, imagining Reggie's fields stretching purple across dew-laden hills, Miss Winthrop's stitches closing tight, and the grand bathhouses swirling steam. That shared hope unites classes, even if methods diverged wildly. As you turn to face your modest breakfast table, you acknowledge that true rest might elude some, yet the mere act of chasing it, whether draped in velvet robes or clutching a tin pot of steaming water, offers a kind of sleepful solace in itself. You rise from your modest breakfast with the gentle resolve to explore a different aspect of Victorian insomnia remedies. Beyond pillows and promenades, there existed a world of peculiar contraptions designed to shepherd you into slumber. As you step through a door into a small workshop tucked behind a row of terrace houses, the air smells faintly of oil and metal, mingled with the lingering whisper of lavender that seems ever present. A brass helmet sits atop a high stool, its interior lined with soft velvet. It gleams under a single kerosene lamp, and you realize that as absurd as it looks, many Victorians believed contraptions like this would deliver them to sleep. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1880s, patent offices brimmed with applications for sleep-inducing apparatus, promising that electrical currents or mechanical vibrations applied to the head would dispel insomnia. Historians still argue whether these bizarre devices were genuine technological innovations or mere curiosities marketed to desperate patients. You lift the brass helmet and feel its surprising weight, solid yet hollow, like holding the crown of a sleep-seeking monarch. Inside, a small plaque indicates its maker, Dr. Horatio Pemberton's electromagnetic slumber inducer, a fringe device purported to use mild electrical pulses to calm racing thoughts. You recall the mention of electrical therapy from Section 2, remembering how some Victorian hospitals experimented with zapping away restless nerves. Here, though, the helmet was intended for home use. Attach wires to a small, battery-like box, place the helmet on your head, and let the gentle tingles lull you into drowsiness. You brush a finger along the interior velvet and find a tiny note card stuck beneath. Use no longer than 15 minutes. Discontinue if mind drifts to dancing sheep. You chuckle. Electric sheep might be a more effective counting tool, but you suspect Pemberton's device delivered more jitters than sleep. A tall shelf nearby holds an assortment of other curious gadgets. On one shelf rests a pair of porcelain eye masks, thin, curved discs painted with lavender sprigs. You pick one up and examine its delicate surface. A mainstream fact: these porcelain masks were sometimes chilled in a bowl of iced water and then placed over the eyes to supposedly stop errant thoughts by cooling the blood vessels around the temples. Historians still argue whether such cold therapy offered any more than a momentary numbing sensation or if it simply reinforced the Victorian obsession with temperature-based cures. Think back to Section 2's mention of cold water dunking. A quirky tidbit: one inventor even designed a porcelain mask connected to a small reservoir of crushed ice that slowly dripped cold water onto a sponge resting on your forehead, promising a constant chill until you nodded off. You imagine yourself wearing the mask, water trickling down your brow, eyes closed, feeling like a human fountain, hardly conducive to deep, uninterrupted sleep. The clink of metal on metal draws your attention to a narrow table where you see an odd contraption resembling a small wooden coffin with padded interiors. You kneel beside it and notice an inscription: the slumber box, postural rest for overactive minds. The idea was that by clamping your arms and legs snugly into padded slots, your body would be forced into a certain position, restricting movement and coaxing relaxation. A mainstream historical fact: proponents claimed that limiting physical motion prevented the mind from wandering, thus facilitating sleep. Historians still argue whether enforced stillness produced restful slumber or merely heightened claustrophobic anxieties in already restless patients. A fringe anecdote recalls that some users emerged from the slumber box claiming they'd had vivid, dream-filled visions of floating through lavender fields. Whether that was genuine or an aftereffect of mild panic remains unclear. You imagine gingerly stepping into the box, the padded slots enclosing your limbs like a bird in a tiny nest, and wonder how long you'd endure before squirming free. As you rise from inspecting the slumber box, you notice an adjacent wall lined with shelves brimming with oddly shaped pillows, none resembling the lavender-stuffed rectangles of Section 6. One, in particular, captures your attention: a horseshoe-shaped cushion made of coiled springs encased in ticked cotton. Its label reads, "The Wakeful Neck Bolster," promising to cradle the spine in perfectly neutral alignment. A mainstream fact: chiropractors and early physiotherapists recommended such bolsters to align the cervical vertebrae, arguing that proper posture prevented restless tossing. Historians still argue whether spinal alignment actually influenced sleep quality or if these bolsters were simply fashionable accessories among the health-conscious. A quirky detail: some owners insisted that the springs inside the bolster produced a faint, rhythmic hum whenever the sleeper shifted, akin to a lullaby of tiny coils. You press a finger into the cushion. It emits a soft squeak that makes you grin, imagining being lulled by a mechanical purr each time you turn over. Moving along, you notice a cabinet housing a series of bizarre devices: small brass cylinders with mesh screens at one end, labeled mind-dampening respiration tubes. You pick up one and peer inside: a tiny barrel-shaped device with perforations, designed to be held beneath the nose, allowing you to breathe concentrated mixtures of herbs. A mainstream historical fact: Victorian apothecaries sold portable inhalers containing blends of lavender, hops, valerian, and other botanicals, marketed as on-the-go sleep aids. Historians still argue whether these inhalers delivered any consistent sedative effect or if the act of holding something beneath one's nose simply distracted the mind from insomnia. A fringe user note carved into the wood claims that inhaling too deeply induced shuddering reveries, whatever that means, and recommended only the lightest of sniffs. You hold the inhaler under your nose and catch a faint whiff of dried herbs, subtle, yet oddly comforting, like breathing in someone's quiet hope for sleep. In a corner of the workshop stands a tall wooden frame adorned with strings of small metal plates, what appears to be a giant harp with no strings. It's labeled the Whispering Nocturne. You step closer, and the craftsman emerges from a back room, wiping oil from his hands. He explains that by lightly tapping the plates in sequence, one would produce a glimmering, slow melody, meant to mirror the steady rhythm of heartbeats slowing into rest. A mainstream fact, proponents asserted that auditory cues in the form of soft, mechanical sounds could synchronize a wanderlust mind to a cadence conducive to sleep. Historians still argue whether these mechanical melodies offered any more efficacy than simply listening to a wind-up music box at bedtime. A quirky detail, he notes that certain customers placed a drop of lavender oil on each metal plate, believing that the fragrance released with each tap added a subliminal layer of calm. The idea of dancing fragrance notes atop clinking metal plates makes you laugh, music and aroma fused in one handcrafted lullaby. Your gaze shifts to a corner shelf where you find a pair of peculiar goggles made of padded leather, each lens tinted lightly blue. A small note beside them reads, "Lunar Gazing Sleep Spectacles." The idea was that by wearing these goggles under dim light, the blue tint filtered out harsh yellow wavelengths, replicating moonlight's gentle glow, thus coaxing melatonin production. A mainstream historical fact, some early sleep researchers believed that proper light wavelengths influenced circadian rhythms, long before electric bulbs dominated. Historians still argue whether these goggles offered any genuine benefit or if they were simply pre-electrician fantasies of optimizing nighttime light. A fringe engineer claimed that wearing them while gazing out the window at the moon realigned one's inner clockwork, though most users complained of looking like overcooked jellyfish in the dark. You slide them onto your face and blink, seeing the room washed in a dreamy cobalt hue, quite psychedelic for 19th century optics. A small wooden plaque catches your eye, guaranteed rest in 7 nights or your money back. Beside it, a ledger records sales of the most popular device, Dr. Bramley's Boundless Blue Pillow, a pillow stuffed with fine metal beads designed to absorb restless energy. A mainstream fact, inventors marketed metal bead pillows as an innovative solution, weight distributed evenly, easing muscle tension. Historians still argue whether the weight distribution offered any meaningful comfort or if the heaviness simply bore down on the skull until weariness took over. A quirky footnote, one customer review notes that if you rolled over too quickly, the beads might shift and create a sudden cave-in beneath the skull, leading to startled awakenings and frantic bead rearrangements. You gingerly lift the boundless blue pillow, its heft substantial, and imagine the muscle memory required to master such a weighted dream anchor. On a small side table lies a leather-bound booklet titled Manual of Nocturnal Contrivances, open to a page illustrating a bonnet-like contraption studded with tiny brass needles, promising acupuncture without pain. A mainstream historical fact, acupuncturists in some Victorian enclaves experimented with adapting Chinese methods for local tastes, offering simplified needle arrays to be applied to pressure points believed to induce sedation. Historians still argue whether these contraptions truly simulated acupuncture's effects or if they were superficial imitations meant to astonish rather than heal. A fringe note scribbled in the margin warns that prolonged use could lead to tempestuous dreams of edge-of-the-world voyages. You peer at the diagram, hundreds of tiny needles protrude like a porcupine's quills, certainly a haptic approach to slumber, but you doubt you'd sign up for the voyage. Before you leave the workshop, you overhear the craftsman muttering about an upcoming invention, a pillow rigged with a small steam chamber that released pulses of warm moisture every few minutes, allegedly to mimic the steady inhalations of deep sleep. You recall Section 5's mention of lavender hydrosol and realize that this new gadget aims to fuse steam therapy with aroma. Yet even as you imagine the soft hiss of warm steam enveloping your face at intervals throughout the night, you wonder if you'd wake suddenly, startled by unexpected puffs of warmth. A mainstream fact, steam tents and inhalation cabinets were used in some Victorian clinics for respiratory relief, but adapting them into pillows was an untested fringe notion. Historians still argue whether such hybrid inventions were earnest attempts at innovation or simply marketing ploys to sell next season's sleepwear. Stepping out onto the quiet street from the workshop, you feel the weight of these inventions settle on your mind. The brass helmet, the porcelain masks, the bondage-like slumber box all stand as testimony to an era desperate for solutions, willing to experiment with metal, steam, and even modest jolts of electricity. You think back to Section 6's lavender pillows, Section 8's moonlit gardens, and Section 10's split between spa opulence and tenement simplicity. All these remedies, simple or elaborate, shared an earnest desire to lull one's body and mind into rest. As you walk toward home, the lamplights cast a gentle glow on the sidewalk, and the cool night air carries a faint echo of lavender from distant windows. You feel a tingle at your temples, imagining the residues of those contraptions lingering, metallic hues dancing behind your eyelids, the promise of a technological lullaby competing with nature's gentle offerings. Perhaps the next insomnia sufferer to enter this workshop will nestle into the boundless blue pillow or crown themselves with Pemberton's helmet and await slumber's descent. But for you, the more subtle virtues of a lavender pillow and a moonlit walk call louder than any brass helmet's hum. Your footsteps soften as you near home, and you realize that in Victorian England, the boundary between earnest innovation and quirked curiosity was as thin as a nightcap's lace. Each invention, mainstream or fringe, conveyed the unwavering hope that no matter how elusive sleep might be, there existed some device unorthodox or refined that could bridge wakefulness and rest. As you slip inside your parlor, the faint hush of a ticking clock reminds you that time moves on, and though many contraptions faded into obscurity, their stories linger as whimsical echoes of that era's relentless pursuit of slumber. You place a hand on your lavender-stuffed pillow waiting in the next room, letting its familiar softness ground you. For all the brass helmets and weighted pillows crafted to tame insomnia, you feel certain that the simple joys of scent and motion remain the truest lullabies. You linger in your parlor's half-light, still cradling hope for slumber, and find that the debate around lavender's sedative magic bubbles beneath every polished jar and botanical manual. As you settle into a well-worn armchair, the air seems pregnant with questions. Does lavender truly lull the mind into rest, or is it a fragrant placebo we cling to in our desperation? A mainstream historical fact: by the late 19th century, numerous medical treatises cited lavender's mild sedative effect, attributing it to compounds such as linalool, believed to slow heart rate. Historians still argue whether these early chemical studies held up to scrutiny or if they merely reflected fashionable theory among apothecaries eager to please affluent patrons. You draw your gaze to a small shelf lined with medical journals, some as crisp as fresh parchment, others yellowed and frayed. One such journal from 1873 describes a case in which a bedridden lady of means inhaled lavender oil nightly, reporting fewer restless watchings and calmer breathing. That report finds itself alongside another article from a rival publication declaring the findings anecdotal at best, noting that the same lady also ate a daily spoonful of honey with ground valerian root. A mainstream historical fact: valerian was widely prescribed as a sleep aid, often alongside lavender, with scholars still arguing whether the combination or simply the passage of time accounted for her improved rest. A quirky detail: some contemporary writers even suggested that the act of opening an ornate bottle of lavender oil, a ritual steeped in anticipation, might calm nerves before any scent diffused, making the journal's data as much about psychology as pharmacology. Leaning forward, you rest elbows on your knees and inhale deeply, recalling that lavender's aromatic molecules are believed to bind to GABA receptors in the nervous system, a modern conclusion that, surprisingly, echoes Victorian speculation. Those early apothecaries lacked the term GABA, yet they insisted that inhaling lavender vapors soothed what they called nervous agitation. Historians still argue whether Victorian descriptions of nervousness mapped neatly onto today's anxiety diagnoses or if they represented a broader, more nebulous category encompassing everything from heartbreak to high tea mishaps. You mused that perhaps a spurned heart and a befuddled nervous system both benefit from a fragrant lull, even if modern researchers deem the evidence inconclusive. By your side, a petite porcelain jar labeled lavender elixir sits half empty. You lift its lid, releasing a gentle waft, and consider a doctor's boasting in 1885 that he administered lavender elixir to hundreds of patients, reporting a 75% improvement in sleep quality. That statistic, however, came under fire in a heated medical debate published months later. Opponents claimed the improvement came from attending a doctor's parlor. Soothing surroundings and attentive bedside manners might have played a larger role than the elixir itself. A mainstream historical fact: Victorian physicians were as fond of moral therapy, kind talk, quiet rooms, and reassuring presence as they were of pharmaceuticals. Historians still argue whether moral therapy or botanical remedies drove genuine progress in treating insomnia, or if they simply combined to create an aura of holistic care. Your gaze drifts to a framed engraving on the wall, a distinguished woman reclining in a chaise longue, inhaling lavender steam from a copper stove beneath her as a housemaid fans her gently. This image hails from a popular 1890s advertising pamphlet, extolling lavender steam baths as the pinnacle of restful luxury. Yet a margin note scribbled by an early critic declares, one must also consider that most bathers were also served a sherry-based nightcap afterward, a confounding variable at best. You raise an eyebrow at that. Combining sherry and lavender does sound delightful, but pinpointing which element induced sleep can be trickier than threading a needle in candlelight. Historians still argue whether advertising pamphlets blurred lines between genuine research and marketing flourishes designed to boost bathhouse patronage. You lean back, letting the chair's upholstery cradle your spine, and recall wandering through a university library where professors of pharmacognosy quibbled endlessly over lavender's properties. One scholar insisted that lavender's scent molecules degrade rapidly once exposed to air, thus the need to store oil in dark, tightly sealed bottles, a mainstream historical fact. Proper storage was critical, and many apothecaries marketed special lavender safes. Historians still argue whether consistent degradation issues meant bulk lavender oil had minimal potency by the time it reached consumers, or if early producers learned to circumvent this with better distillation methods. A quirky footnote from a student's diary mentions an industrious apprentice who wore lavender-stained gloves to reduce odor absorption, a small innovation that apparently pleased poison-averse clients who feared apothecary air. In that library, arguments raged about whether inhaling lavender directly or applying it topically yielded better results. A mainstream historical fact, some studies recommended a dab of oil on the temples, arguing the skin around the temples was permeable enough to allow penetration of sedative compounds. Historians still argue whether topical applications really made a significant neurological impact, or if the benefit derived mostly from gentle massage accompanying the application. A fringe anecdote describes a society hostess who insisted on having lavender oil massaged into her feet before bed, a practice she believed transmitted sleep through her soles into her dreams. You chuckle at the image of sleepy feet clinging to a hope that toes might ferry you to dreamland, though you concede that foot rubs often work wonders to distract a busy mind.
A breeze stirs the heavy curtains, and that vapory movement reminds you of steam-filled chambers in certain Victorian clinics where lavender vaporizers hissed. But detractors insisted that the steam's heat, not the lavender, accounted for patient relaxation, a mainstream historical fact. Steam rooms were a staple of European health resorts, and scholars still argue whether adding lavender did anything more than mask residual chlorine or mineral tastes.
Quirky voices in fringe publications claimed that such eucalyptic lavender blends drove away nocturnal spirits, promising ethereal protection alongside drowsiness. You imagine patients half asleep, clutching rosewood wands dipped in lavender, chanting hush-like mantras, at once soothing and delightfully absurd. You shift in the armchair and notice the fireplace's dying embers. The warm glow flickers across your face as you ponder a report from a leading dermatologist who argued in 1892 that diluted lavender oil applied to the wrists lowered pulse by no less than 10 beats per minute in test subjects. Yet a rival defense argued that subjects knew they were in a study, sat quietly under warm lamps, and were told to relax, thus settling their pulse regardless of lavender. A mainstream historical fact, controlled double-blind trials did not exist as we know them. Historians still argue whether any Victorian clinical trials counted as legitimate experimental designs or if they were elaborate anecdotes crafted to dazzle journal editors. You toss the detail into your mental journal and make a note to appreciate modern clinical rigor, albeit reluctantly, since you still worry about reading charts at 2 a.m. Sighing, you swivel to face an ornate side table covered with small vials of lavender essential oil, hydrosol sprays, and a few unmarked droppers. You pick up one dropper bottle and deposit a single drop of oil onto a white handkerchief. The aroma swells instantly, floral, herbaceous, and clear. But you recall a professional critique from a herbalist who demanded stronger evidence. If lavender truly held potent sedative action, why did my patients often report equal solace from rosemary, jasmine, or lily of the valley sachets? That herbalist's question underscores a mainstream insight. Many botanicals share calming aromatics, and preferences often came down to individual taste rather than universal potency. Historians still argue whether lavender's primacy in Victorian sleep lore derived from genuine superiority or from a savvy marketing push by apothecaries and estate gardeners. Your gaze drifts toward a dusty pamphlet titled Lavender vs. Valerian, a comparative treatise.
You pry it open to a section where the author declares, inhaling lavender on even-numbered nights and valerian on odd-numbered nights demonstrates that neither herb holds exclusive claim to slumber. But that conclusion seemed too balanced to excite Victorian consumers.
Instead, lavender acquired almost mythic status, partly because its flowers were easier to cultivate than valerian roots, which required more labor and storage. A fringe note in the margin scoffs, high tea ladies prefer lavender because its hue flatters their gowns. Historians still argue whether social aesthetics unduly influenced botanical preferences, intertwining fashion with pharmacology. A carriage strolls by outside, horsehooves clicking on the street stones. You inhale once more, weighing each argument in your mind: the triumphs of chemical isolation, the shortcomings of anecdotal reports, the seductive pull of fragrance itself. You imagine a modern laboratory testing lavender's exact chemical composition, linalool, linylyl acetate, and other compounds, then comparing results with 19th century observations. Yet even in your imagined lab, you sense that researchers would still ask, does a scent alone change brainwaves? Or does the ritual of unlocking a bottle, the gentle inhalation, and the belief in its efficacy form the true remedy? Historians still argue whether the ritual itself, with its immersive sensory cues, constituted the greatest healing power. Before you drift from your reverie, you recall a guest speaker at a recent Botanical Society meeting who ignited the room by insisting that modern aromatherapy owes more to Victorian parlor experiments than to ancient herbal lore, a mainstream historical fact. Many contemporary aromatherapists credit Victorian-era texts for their early formulations. Historians still argue whether this lineage represents a seamless evolution of knowledge or a selective revival of quaint practices repackaged for modern wellness fads. That memory wraps around you like a soft blanket, reminding you that history often accepts echoes as heritage. You rise from the armchair, feeling a subtle thrill at having witnessed these debates from within your parlor's cocoon. You move toward the window, where midnight's hush beckons one last inhale. The street lamps glow, casting long, drowsy shadows, and you consider whether you'll dare to trust lavender's whispered promise or resign yourself to another restless night. Either way, you now carry within you the full spectrum of arguments: scholarly skepticism, botanical optimism, societal influences, and the occasional fringe flourish. As you slide the window open, a soft breeze drifts in, carrying the faintest whiff of lavender mingled with cool night air. You let the curtain billow imperceptibly, watching its gentle dance as moonlight silvers its folds. In that moment, you realize that the debate itself is part of lavender's charm, an invitation to question, to wonder, and perhaps, to believe. You close your eyes, allowing that breeze to tease your senses, and feel sleep stirring at the edges of consciousness. A small clock chimes once, soft and patient, as if marking not just the hour but the cumulative weight of your botanical contemplations. You blink slowly, your hand still loosely resting on the window latch, and you wonder if any of those Victorian physicians, so convinced of lavender's virtue, ever faced nights like this, heavy with thoughts, burdened with contradictory reports, haunted not by insomnia alone but by the pressure to recommend remedies they only half believed in. A mainstream historical fact: 19th century doctors often juggled empirical observations with public expectation, crafting soothing tonics that balanced what patients wanted to hear with what scant evidence they had. Historians still argue whether this dual role, as caretaker and performer, obscured true scientific progress or softened medicine into something more humane. You turn your gaze toward a leather-bound ledger beside your desk, still open to a page where you once copied excerpts from a famed 1882 sleep diary kept by a noblewoman prone to insomnia. She chronicled her lavender nights with fervor, noting changes in scent intensity, placement of sachets, and whether she recited prayers or sonnets while inhaling. The diary became a minor sensation, spawning copycats and even influencing how apothecaries labeled their products: infusion number 4, best for psalm nights, red one. A quirky detail: her entry for September 19 claims she slept best with lavender placed inside her pillowcase and a stanza from Keats whispered into the darkness. Historians still argue whether this blending of sensory ritual and poetic rhythm produced a cognitive anchor for rest, much like modern sleep hygiene practices rely on repetition and calm environmental cues. You close the ledger and let your fingers trail over the embossed gold filigree, marveling that the very tools used to track sleep have remained strikingly unchanged: diaries, scent rituals, curated routines. A mainstream historical fact: even in the era of wristwatch EEG monitors and smartphone sleep trackers, researchers encourage sleep journals to identify behavioral patterns. Historians still argue whether this enduring practice shows a timeless respect for subjective experience or reflects the medical community's ongoing uncertainty about insomnia's deeper causes. You muse that maybe insomnia itself is a question disguised as a condition, one we've never quite answered, only circled, scented, and recorded in elegant prose. Rising, you approach the fireplace where only faint heat lingers. On the mantelpiece, tucked behind a vase of dried herbs, sits a folded clipping from a 1901 household periodical, Miss Agatha's Guide to Restful Living. You unfold it carefully. One section declares with unwavering confidence: a handkerchief steeped in lavender, tied about the wrist, shall cradle one's pulse and stir gentle dreams. But below that assurance, a reader's handwritten rebuttal, scrawled in blue ink, did all this, still dreamt of thunder and unpaid debts. A mainstream historical fact, Victorian periodicals frequently published reader correspondence, creating spaces for medical folklore to be shared, questioned, and shaped communally. Historians still argue whether these exchanges democratized knowledge or diluted scientific standards by giving every opinion equal footing. You smile faintly at the contradiction, folding the clipping back into its hiding place. Something about that candid reader, wide-eyed and weary, brings comfort. Not all remedies work. Not all claims soothe. But the attempt, the ritual, the community, the careful tying of a lavender-scented handkerchief is a kind of balm in itself. You think of friends who've tried every app, every pill, every piece of advice, only to find solace in something small, an old book, a weighted blanket, a mug of tea warmed by memory more than chemistry. A gentle knock at your inner mind's door, an idea forms. Perhaps lavender doesn't work in isolation. Perhaps it belongs to a constellation of cues, warm textiles, dim light, the sound of quiet breathing, an ensemble cast in a play where rest is coaxed, not commanded. A mainstream historical fact, 21st century sleep therapists emphasize cue association and pre-sleep routines, not unlike the Victorian evening rituals. Historians still argue whether this continuity reflects true medical wisdom passed through generations, or merely our endless yearning to believe in the power of gentle beginnings. At the edge of your consciousness, you sense sleep approaching, not like a train barreling down tracks, but like fog unfurling over a meadow. Subtle. Curious. Indifferent to whether you deserve it. You reach for your lavender sachet, tuck it beside your pillow, and let your body ease down at last. No grand conclusions tonight. Only layered possibilities. The scent curls up beside you like a paragraph not yet finished. And in the quiet, before your mind fully lets go, you think, if lavender is just a story we tell ourselves, then let it be a good one. Somewhere between a ticking mantel clock and the sigh of wind slipping past the windowpane, your thoughts wander again, this time toward the strange bedfellows of sleep and electricity. You're still curled under your blanket, lavender sachet still loyal beside your pillow, but now the room around you seems to brighten faintly with the promise of invention. That's because, toward the end of the Victorian era, insomnia wasn't just a matter for herbalists and moonlit poets. It became the concern of electricians. A mainstream historical fact, in the 1890s, electric sleep aids began circulating in upscale catalogs. These weren't shocking beds or Frankenstein coils, just modest gadgets like electrogalvanic rings, magnetized pillows, and even wearable headbands wired to small battery packs. The idea was that low doses of electrical current could reset the nervous system and lull the brain toward repose. Historians still argue whether these early electrotherapy devices were true innovations or elaborate placebos disguised by shiny copper and confident marketing. You reach for one of these odd contraptions now, not literally, of course, but in memory. The 1898 model on your mind is the Dr. Scott's electric hairbrush, which, oddly enough, claimed to promote restful sleep through scalp stimulation. A quirky tidbit, while marketed mostly to anxious men, some women used it simply because it gave them shinier hair. As one user wrote to a ladies' column, "My dreams remained troubled, but my fringe was radiant." That's Victorian multitasking at its finest. Looking at an old advert now, you see a bespectacled doctor with one hand on a model's head and the other raised triumphantly. A cure for all sleep troubles, the caption insists, beside a list of vague ailments: brain fog, ghostly restlessness, male bloom. You wonder how many people genuinely found relief, or at least distraction, in these buzzing scalp rituals. Historians still argue whether such inventions reflected hope, desperation, or simply a fascination with the dazzling possibilities of invisible forces. From here, your attention drifts to the growing influence of light, or rather, its absence. By the late 1800s, gaslights and then incandescent bulbs began spilling into private homes, disrupting circadian rhythms that had once followed the gentle cue of sunset. You imagine the soft hiss of a lamp being extinguished, followed by the creak of a floorboard and the scratch of a match, as someone reluctantly puts their evening to bed. A mainstream historical fact, studies show that artificial light, particularly blue-spectrum light, delays melatonin release and suppresses the brain's natural signals for sleep. Historians still argue whether Victorians intuited this connection before science confirmed it, because there were early warnings, even then, about the unnatural prolonging of evening brightness. Some physicians suggested that excessive reading under artificial lamps might fray the nerves and disturb the soul's resting hour. Whether that was proto-neuroscience or poetic concern is debatable. You imagine yourself as one such late reader, curled in a green velvet armchair beneath a flickering wall sconce, devouring pages from a Gothic novel you swore you'd only skim. Your eyes ache slightly, and your nerves hum just a little too fast. In that moment, you understand why Victorians began seeking more than lavender. They needed ways to quiet not just the body, but the overstimulated mind. This gave rise to what were called bedroom therapies, a mix of sensory design, ritual, and subtle manipulation of the senses. Walls were painted in calming greens, linens scented with rose or chamomile, even wallpaper patterns selected to avoid visual strain. A quirky design fad in the 1890s involved painting stars on bedroom ceilings with glow-in-the-dark phosphorus paint, mimicking the night sky indoors. Historians still argue whether this created a soothing illusion or merely gave insomniacs something else to fixate on. Now back in your imagined bedroom, you lean your head on the embroidered bolster and listen to nothing. That silence? It was curated. Victorian homes had heavy drapes, carpets, and velvet upholstery not just for aesthetics, but to dampen sound. A mainstream historical fact: the wealthier the household, the quieter the sleeping chamber. Some even installed thick inner doors to buffer against servants' footsteps or distant horse hooves. And just as today's insomniacs turn to white noise machines and nature sound playlists, Victorians had their version of audio therapy too. Clockwork music boxes, small tabletop fountains, and even the gentle clicking of a pendulum were said to have hypnotic effects. A quirky case: one doctor reportedly prescribed the sound of gently roosting chickens recorded on wax cylinder, though how he obtained such a soundtrack remains a mystery. Historians still argue whether these auditory experiments were grounded in actual research or just whims dressed in waistcoats. Tonight, your room has no chicken recordings. But maybe you have your fan, a rain app, or just the steady rhythm of your own breath. You take a moment to notice that sound. Not analyze it, just hear it. Just feel it. Because that's what they were after, all those years ago. Not perfection. Not control. Just surrender. Just sleep. The pillow is soft beneath your head, and you can almost smell the ghosts of all those Victorian remedies: lavender, rosewater, lemon balm, even the imagined tingle of a battery-powered comb brushing against your scalp. But tonight, the story's winding down, and with it, your mind floats gently into the quieter corners of the 19th century bedroom. The world outside your window hums with distant traffic and modern concerns, but in here, we're still surrounded by tasseled curtains and candlelit silhouettes. Now, let's return to the most tender of all Victorian sleep cures: the rituals of love, longing, and lullabies. Not all remedies came in bottles or brass casings. Sometimes, the thing that finally sent you off to sleep was a letter from someone dear, or the memory of one. You settle deeper into your blanket and imagine yourself in a soft, high bed in 1893, your fingers brushing across paper edges on a nightstand. Maybe it's a letter from a son at university, or a fiancé stationed in India. The envelope is creased, the handwriting familiar. A mainstream historical fact: Victorians often kept loved ones' letters in their bedrooms, reading them before sleep to ease the ache of absence. It wasn't unusual for people to memorize entire passages and whisper them into the dark. Historians still argue whether this nightly ritual brought more peace or pain, but in any case, it was a common practice to hold on to words when arms could not. Some even wrote to themselves tiny notes of reassurance or prayer tucked beneath pillows. A quirky tidbit: one sleep-deprived Londoner wrote daily affirmations like, "Tomorrow shall be easier," and "You've done well today," and folded them into the hem of his nightshirt. His journal later described this habit as hugging the soul with paper. Maybe that's all some of us need. There were lullabies, too, though not always sung to children. Gentle songs, played on pianoforte or hummed quietly in drawing rooms, often floated down corridors at bedtime. Some boarding schools even designated a staff member, usually the matron, to sing lullabies to students in their dormitories, a practice more maternal than disciplinary. A mainstream historical fact: music was so tied to sleep in some circles that entire Victorian songbooks were published with titles like Nocturnes for gentle rest and Melodies for the melancholy heart. One popular tune, Dreams by Candlelight, included lines about moonlit oceans and whispering angels. You don't need to know the melody to feel its mood: slow, sentimental, and just wistful enough to loosen the knots of the day. As sleep eluded them, some Victorians reached for literature again, only this time, not gothic horror, but what they called sleep fiction. Gentle tales with low stakes, happy endings, and meandering plots. Think pastoral romances, slow-paced travelogues, and moral fables about loyal dogs or village bakers. A quirky fringe habit among certain aristocrats involved hiring a private reader to sit nearby and read aloud until the household's last lamp was snuffed. Sometimes, this reader dozed off before the listener did. Historians still argue whether these stories were chosen for their comfort or simply their lack of excitement. Either way, the intent was clear: no twists, no tension, just words to wrap around the mind like a soft shawl. Which, if you think about it, is more or less what we've been doing here, together. And so we come to the final oddity of Victorian sleep, the concept of the waking dream. It was the belief, held loosely by poets and spiritualists alike, that sleep wasn't an escape, but a passage. That, in the quiet of night, between two dreams, you might glimpse something divine. Not ghosts or visions, but understanding. Clarity. You wonder, there in your imaginary four-poster bed, whether those dreamers ever truly found answers, or if, like you, they simply learned to love the quiet search. The candle on your bedside table has burned low. The bed warmer, filled earlier with coals, is now a soft memory of heat. Your eyelids grow heavier. You're not quite asleep, but you're not fully here either. And just like that, you're drifting now. The story has ebbed, the candles dimmed, and the sounds of the world, both past and present, have quieted. Your breathing is steady, a little slower than before, and the warmth of the room, whether real or imagined, cradles you gently. You let go of the heavy quilt of history and sink instead into the softness of the moment. No more lists of ingredients, no more strange medical contraptions or restless midnight walks. Just the hush of night, the echo of old lullabies, and the distant scent of lavender, or maybe that's just your memory playing kindly tricks. As you lie there, eyes closed or fluttering on the edge, know this: you've wandered far tonight. Across cobbled lanes and gaslit rooms. Past herbal gardens and moonlit parks. Through dreams dreamt by those long gone, yet somehow still familiar. The Victorians didn't have all the answers to sleep. Neither do we. But we share the same wish, the same hope, that when we close our eyes, the world becomes gentle. So rest now. Let your body sink a little deeper into the bed. Let your thoughts quiet, like pages slowly turning to a blank. There's nothing more to do, nothing left to understand. Just this breath. And then the next. You're safe. You're warm. You're not alone in the dark. And sleep, old, strange, beautiful sleep, is already on its way.